who, it turned out, really could drink whiskey by the pint. Claire was having one of those strange moments when a leader has to look like they are the ones in control, or at the very least have some idea of what's going on. She didn't have the slightest idea where all the bespectacled scientists had come from. She had said to Ants that she needed to bring experts in to look at the mess, and now there were hundreds, literally, hundreds of the aforementioned people, crawling all over the place and theoretically under her command. She knew that there was a logical connection between the two things, but she hadn't been the one who had made it. They had set up a temporary command under a large piece of metal which stuck up from the mess. There everyone who could be spared was poring over the security footage which Andrew had dug out. It wasn't that the footage was damaged in any way, but it was taking a very long time to get information from the tapes. There was just so much of it to watch. She had put Andrew in charge of the recordings, mostly to keep him out of the way, but he had taken to the task with intensity which surprised Claire. She wanted to put that down to good leadership, but she knew that it was really just simple dumb luck, and then she started wondering how many great military victories were the results of dumb luck. Out of the corner of her eye she saw a figure running toward her, ducking and weaving the whole way, like a puppet with someone joggling the strings around. She didn't even need to focus on him. "Hello, Andrew," she said, as he reached her, out of breath. "Me Miss Clare," he panted, "we found something, you should see." Claire noticed that Andrew still didn't seem to be able to make eye contact with her, but he had gotten through a complete sentence this time. "I should write a self-help course," she thought. She followed Andrew back to their makeshift command center, where dozens of computer screens let off an eerie glow even in the bright noonlight of the Amazon. All the staff of the center were clustered around one of the computers in the corner. She walked up and looked into the monitor. The recordings were in black and white, but she could see that whoever had decorated the room that the monitor was depicting had excellent taste. She recognized the faces of her editor and her immediate boss, sitting in lazy boys no less. Claire almost laughed seeing that. At least she knew for sure that they had been there. She looked at the third person that the camera showed. "Well, hello," she thought, "who are you?" The man, whoever he was sitting on what was clearly an expensive couch and looked like he was the one in charge. "I found my lead," she thought. She turned suddenly to Andrew, who jumped back in shock. "Get a clear picture of that man's face to Ants," she said, "and when that is done, follow the footage backwards and forwards. I want you to be able to tell me within the hour exactly how Tony and Greg got there, and how they left." Andrew made a sharp jerk of the head, which may have been a nod. Then he sprinted outside before turning and sprinting back in, looking embarrassed. As he started giving orders, Claire excused herself and walked back into the noonlight. She could feel a wicked grin spreading across her face. Things are looking up, she thought. Which is to say, everyone who could be spared. Lord Green Badger sipped some variety of fruit punch. He had found it in the back of the fridge and it hadn't changed color, so he had decided that it was probably safe to drink. He was sitting in his chair in front of his laptop. Slouched might be a better word actually, with his legs tucked in so tightly that his chin was actually resting on his knee. They recognized the picture that the team in the Amazon was sending home. Well, he thought, "Ernest, you've got sloppy." He remembered being asked to take part in Ernest's logging program, but he had turned him down. Now with the benefit of hindsight, he was glad he had. He would have liked to have said that it was due to good planning that he had opted out of the logging scheme, but really it was dumb luck. "Letting them get a picture of you," he thought, "that's going to cost you, Ernest." Lord Green Badger had considered it really unfortunate that the second team had chosen to stay in the Amazon, but this was so entertaining that he was almost glad they had. Still, they were now nothing more than a sideshow, and he had bigger things to worry about. He thought about Greg. Devlin and Johnson had lost the man. He had heard his cousin yelling at Johnson about putting the tracking device on the wrong man. Lord Green Badger was very impressed that Johnson had managed to plant a tracking device at all, given that he was about a good kilometer away when Devlin had been talking to them. Lord Green Badger didn't think that Greg would choose to put in an appearance now. It wouldn't fit the pattern, but he would want to get in contact with the other two. After all, he would want to stop them worrying. Thanks to the diligent efforts of Devlin and Johnson, he knew the location of Mr. Thompson, and it was possible that they had located the girl as well. Lord Green Badger hadn't been able to dig up much information on her. Lord Green Badger didn't really smile. He had had a busy day yesterday and he was still very tired, but he did not in a self-satisfied way. If he did choose to contact either of them, then he would be wonderfully placed to profit. Devlin felt that he was really beginning to lose his mind. He was also really beginning to understand what his doctor kept saying about stress. He could feel his heart tight in his chest, and his throat was dry, and he hadn't managed to sleep while he was off duty, so the front of his brain felt like some meat-fisted twat had grabbed it and was squeezing. When Johnson had walked in, Devlin had thought, "This is it, I've lost my sense of time as well." But then he had seen the clock on the jet's display, and that had just left him confused. "What are you doing up?" he asked. "Your shift isn't for another 2 hours." "We have new orders," said Johnson, sitting down. Devlin's brow corrugated. "Nothing came through on the radio," he said. "These orders aren't from her ladyship," said Johnson lightly, while playing with the display. Many words flashed quickly through Devlin's head. Words like mutiny were very prominent. "Where did they come from?" asked Devlin, fighting to keep his voice calm. "One of my other bosses," said Johnson, like a man commenting on the weather. Devlin felt fairly sure that this was against the spirit of their contracts at least. "Why do you have more bosses?" he asked, horrified now. "In case someone else requires my services," said Johnson. "I have just been advanced an impressive sum for a single job, which should take all of 5 minutes. We have to find a large airborne target, probably a blimp, which is upsetting one of the people I work for. I have a radar signature, and it's nearby. Then, after we've found it, we have to bombard it with breacher missiles until it stops being a large airborne target. If you want to help me with this, I will happily split my retainer with you." Devlin took all of this in a kind of numb horror. Abandoning a task like this, and no matter how he put it, that's how it was looking to Devlin, went against everything he had tried to be over the years. Some old pilot's instinct warned him that they were flying into a patch of cloud, but he was barely even aware of it. "And if I don't want to help you?" he asked, like a man trying to talk down a gunman. "Then you really should have said something before I started to change our course 5 minutes ago," said Johnson, coolly. He pressed a button on the display, and Devlin watched the first breacher arc away from the jet. Charlotte was watching the vigilante camp when her cell phone went off. She answered it, already knowing who it would be. "Charlotte, are you in France?" "Yes, ma'am. I'm sending you new coordinates now. They're for a little peasant army camp in the Transylvanian mountains. I need you to get there right now." "Yes, ma'am. I want you to go in there undercover. One of our targets is there, but it's not our main target. I need you to work some information out of him. I want you to see if he knows where the primary target is, and then stick close to him if you think you have a chance of meeting the primary target yourself." Devlin and Johnson can't see enough from that silly jet of theirs. "Yes, ma'am." "Good girl, hop to it." "Yes, ma'am." The phone went dead. Charlotte put it away and thought a string of unpleasant words. Now she had a problem. Her ladyship had no idea that Charlotte had seen Tony close up before this point. It was all very well for her to say, "Go in undercover," but Charlotte knew she would be recognized in seconds. She thought through the problem. There seemed to be only one way out. Wishing that she knew more than one top-level vampire, Charlotte prepared for an unpleasant trip. Charlotte had never seen Miss Alpha at rest. It stood to reason that somewhere there must be a little apartment where she spent her sleeping hours, but Charlotte had never seen it. She also had never seen Miss Alpha off guard. It didn't work like that. You never went to visit Miss Alpha, you talked to the closest bat, and then she decided if she wanted to see you. This time it looked like Charlotte was in luck. The cave seemed to billow out as thousands of bats made their way to the exit and collapsed into a human form. "Hello, Miss Epsilon," the figure said. Charlotte resisted the urge to bow. "Thank you for seeing me," she said, like her mother had taught her. "It is always my honor." Miss Alpha did a little girl twist. "Thanks, Miss Epsilon," she said, with a slight lisp. Charlotte was sure it was an act. "Can I help?" she asked. Charlotte was relived, as incredibly terrifying as Miss Alpha was. She always got straight to the point. "I need to change my appearance," she said. "Oh," said Miss Alpha, "why does a pretty lady like you want to do that?" As much as Charlotte wanted to lie, she thought better of it. "After you had been around a while you started to hear stories about people who had lied to Miss Alpha. I need to go undercover," she said, "and the man I'm meant to be meeting for the first time invited me to dinner last time we met," she continued, feeling that this wasn't something she could really hide. "Oh, okay," said Miss Alpha, pointing her palm at Charlotte. There was no preamble. Charlotte felt her body changing shape. Every atom in her body started to bubble and wave, and then wrench itself into an entirely new position. It wasn't entirely pleasant. "But it's just for a day or two," said Miss Alpha, "so call me before it goes away." Then she exploded into a cloud of bats, and was gone. Charlotte lay on the rock of the cave mouth, gasping breath into unfamiliar lungs, and she realized the position she was now in. The mission's success depended on Miss Alpha's goodwill. If she chose to stop helping, then no one else could change her into this form again, and she would have to forfeit all the work she had done with Tony, and no one else could go back in because it would look too suspicious. Charlotte had been prepared for mind control, but this was something different. She was entirely in Miss Alpha's power. Tony didn't think he had moved so fast in his whole life. When the first dragon had hit, he had been running before he had even registered what had happened. He guessed that he had to be the furthest away from the camp now, and it was only now that he risked a look back. It was a truly great battle, worthy of an epic poem. The jet ducked and weaved and spun and dived, and fired missiles. That wasn't a minor fact. While the dragons swarmed. On the face of things, the dragons were the clear winners. They were more mobile, and there was more of them, but to Tony's great surprise, they weren't winning. The pilot of the jet was putting it through some maneuvers that seemed to fly in the face of the laws of physics. It was very impressive, but Tony knew that there was no way that he could keep it up forever. If nothing else, it looked as though the wings would tear off soon. With a shock, Tony realized that he recognized both the jet and the dragons. The jet had been there in the Amazon. It had disgorged a fake FBI agent, who had tried to take him in. The dragons were the same ones that he had climbed over for years on end at 20,000 feet. That angry cloud behind them, which seemed to be chasing the jet, must contain the dryads, he realized. He wasn't happy with either of those groups being anywhere near him, so he kept running. Wait for me," called a woman's voice behind him. Tony turned around, and saw a copper-haired woman running up behind him. He considered running faster. His trust reflex seemed a little strained nowadays. But he had left the camp so fast that he had forgotten to pick his bag up, while this woman seemed to have had the presence of mind to bring food along. Plus, she was curvy, and even in a life-or-death situation, Tony still liked to consult with his secondary head. He stopped running, and let the woman catch up with him. "Hi," she said, panting a little. "I'm Alice." Tony nodded. "That's nice, I'm Tony. Tell me, Alice, how fast can you run?" Greg was in a picturesque village when the battle had started, but even over a mountain range it is hard to miss a swarm of dragons attacking a jet. He watched the battle with mild interest. He was sure that there would be a story behind it, and he suspected that Tony would feature in the story somehow. But he didn't see how it would affect him directly. He supposed that it might draw attention away from him, which was always a good thing. Crazy Sven was still in the small town equivalent of a pawn shop, trying to invent a legitimate way to find himself in possession of 70 wedding rings, which were all engraved with different names. "I am being how you say? Man whore. They are of the gold, you want or not?" Greg was still thinking about how to get in contact with Tony and Free Flower, and he was having trouble coming up with a way which wouldn't lead interested parties directly to him. He was also starting to get bored with the jet plane/dragon battle, and he started to play with the dwarf horn that he had hung around his neck. His wandering eyes fixed on a vertical stripe which stuck into the sky like a needle poking the setting sun. He had thought of them, of course, but he had hoped he would think of something else. Going anywhere near that tower was not something he ever wanted to do. But it had been almost a week, and he hadn't managed to think of anything else. He turned around and called out to Crazy Sven, "Hey, how do you feel about a road trip?" Tony woke up very slowly. He had been sleeping on rough ground all night, and this time there was no alcohol in his system. His back ached like someone had used it as a punching bag, and then bit it repeatedly. He decided that must be the reason that he had woken up so early. The sun wasn't even up yet, and that wasn't like him at all. Alice had slept next to him, she was still soundly asleep. Tony felt envious, and old. He realized that he could see quite clearly, despite the darkness. He thought that was very odd, and he looked over the hills below him. There was a village below, and it was on fire. Tony couldn't help but feel responsible. After all, the only way it would make sense for both the fake.b.I and the dryads to be here is if they were following him. He looked around, trying to see what had happened to the battle. But the sky was clear, and though there were a lot of fires in the visible landscape right now, none of them looked very familiar. Tony's first instinct was to run down the hill and start helping the village out, but he stopped first and thought things through. It was something that Greg kept trying to get him to do. He now knew that Free Flower was alive, and by the looks of things, it was silly to have ever worried about her. He also knew that Greg had escaped the dwarfish ambush, and Tony knew from experience that it wasn't really necessary to worry about him. He worried anyway, but even if he could get in contact with Greg, it was beginning to occur to Tony that it just might not be a good idea. If people wanted to bring Greg in badly enough that they would dedicate a giant jet to the task, then it was probably a bad idea to draw attention to him. So with nothing left to do, that left the village. He started thinking about how he could help out. The fires seemed to be mostly under control by this point, but there would be injured people. There were always injured people, and Tony wouldn't have survived as long as a reporter if he hadn't learned a few medical tricks. He turned to Alice, and wondered whether it would be right to wake her. It probably wouldn't be right to just walk off and leave her. He looked down at the village again, and then back at Alice. He knew he had some paper in his pocket. It was the back of a beer label from the army camp. He rummaged in Alice's pack, feeling rather guilty about doing so, but again he was a reporter, and this wasn't the first time he had done it. He found a stick of charcoal and started writing on the back of the label. "Alice," he wrote, "I've gone to help out in the village down below. I didn't want to wake you because it looked like you needed the rest." Then he tucked the impromptu letter into her hand. It wasn't much of a letter, he knew, but it was before dawn after all. He started walking down the side of the mountain. As the sun rose, he thought it made the ruined village look quite pretty. The sun was already high in the sky by the time that Greg woke up. The front seat of a taxi is a surprisingly comfortable place to sleep, once you get used to it. By the looks of it, Crazy Sven had been awake all night. Greg realized all of a sudden that he had never seen the man sleep. That might explain a few things, he thought. He suddenly realized that he couldn't really see the sun in the sky. He focused forward. Crazy Sven had apparently been driving all night as well. They had covered a lot of ground, and Greg could see the EML tower closing in on them. Home, he thought, or one of them at least. Crazy Sven took the taxi through the stone arch in such a violent skid that Greg was glad that someone had made the arch intangible. Greg saw the embossed gold letters as he passed. "The Experimental Magic League," it read, "we will eventually solve all your problems." Not the way I see it, thought Greg to himself. There are hundreds of reasons why magic will never be more than an interesting plaything, and they all live in this building. Crazy Sven brought the car to a dignified halt, halfway up the steps, and leaning on a stone lion. Then he got out and looked around. "Dis is funny place," he said. Greg was almost certain that wasn't his normal accent. "Why are you having the desire to come here?" Greg got out as well. In his case it involved climbing over a stone lion. "I need to get in contact with my friends," he said. "There are a few people who owe me some favors." "Ah," said Crazy Sven, "you are going to be shaking down some punks, yeah?" "I hope not," said Greg. "My first exit from here was less than dignified. I would like to have the option of returning at some point in the future." "Yeah," said Crazy Sven, "let's find ourselves a robe crotch." Greg wasn't entirely sure when he had started to enjoy traveling with Crazy Sven. It was like the sheer surrealism of doing it had entered his life like white noise, and wasn't really there unless he focused on it. It had been a very long time since he was last here. Greg squared his shoulders and marched purposefully up the stairs, head held high. He reached the heavy oaken doors, wrenched them open, and ducked as a rock whizzed over his head and turned into a pigeon. "Damn it," cried a voice from inside, "it's a pigeon again." "Yeah," said a rougher voice, "but did you see how far it flew? I bet if we add more sloth hair, we could even get them to explode." "Yeah," said the first voice again, it didn't sound even slightly angry now. "Maybe we could get them all to explode at once, that would be completely badass." Slightly shaken, and remembering why he hadn't fit in the first place, Greg straightened up. He turned to the two nuts inside and said, "I'm looking for Louise Green, you wouldn't know where to find her, would you?" One of the nuts, a heavy-set youth with dirty blonde hair, looked up. "You mean Professor Green?" he asked. Greg thought about the Louise Green he had known. "Probably," he admitted. "Upstairs," said the youth, who was now doing something with his fingers which probably counted as serious fire risk. Greg left him to it. It didn't seem worth the effort to get any more information out of him. While he climbed the stairs, he thought about the sheer mess and disorder of this place. There were vines cascading from one of the tall towers, and he passed one of the strange parts of the wall that kept exploding and fixing itself. No one had managed to turn that off since his time, he saw. He reached the top of the staircase, and stomped automatically on the left foot of one of the suits of armor. The left leg could swing up on its own, he remembered. There were some mistakes that you didn't make twice. He was in a long hall of doorways, with things written on the doors. One of the doors seemed to have many little explosions going on behind it. One of them appeared to be holding back a small ocean. Greg ignored both of them and kept walking. He knew the office that the new Professor Green would have probably taken. While he was walking, he noticed that Crazy Sven hadn't followed him up. Greg thought about the sheer mayhem that a civilian could unleash here, in this place. He thought about suits of armor, which tended to roam the hallways and lynch mobs, simply because everyone felt that they were much too busy to stop them. He thought of simple spells that anyone could cast, but only masters could control. He thought about all of this, and then imagined a huge, hairy man of unspecified nationality, thrown into the mix. Then Greg kept walking. There was nothing that Crazy Sven could do which would surpass the kinds of thing which the teachers did to illustrate their points, or for a good laugh. Greg reached the end of the hallway, and stood in front of the door there. Professor Green, the door read, Master of Communications. He could remember this office clearly. At some point before his time, there had been some kind of drain the power of a dead god experiment, and the office on the floor below had been completely drained of magic. Nothing more would work there. Greg squared his shoulders again, and as an afterthought ran his fingers through his hair, and wished that Crazy Sven had owned a shaving razor. Then he pushed on the door and walked in. Louise was sitting at her desk, typing on her laptop, when Greg walked in. She didn't look surprised to see him, but then it was very hard to surprise Louise Green. She was the undisputed master of rewriting her plans to include acts of gods. She indicated to the empty seat in front of her desk, and Greg sat down. "How can I help you?" she asked. Greg had forgotten how blunt she could be. "Not even a hello?" he asked. "I thought we parted on fairly good terms." Louses still didn't look surprised, but her eyebrows did climb a little higher on her face. "Since when did you start needing greetings?" she asked. That gave Greg a shock of self-recognition. "I don't know," he said. "Fairly recently, I think." Louise nodded. "It's not quite what I would have expected from you, but, very well." "Hello Greg, how are you today?" It sounded like she was reading the words of a card, and Greg couldn't help but feel patronized. He decided to skip the small talk. "I need you to help me contact a friend," he said. "If you can pull this off, then you can forget about that giant rat you let escape when I was covering for you. So that it would stop collecting dirt." Greg had never heard of one of these experiments being successful. Most of the time it just brought the god back to life, and then everyone had to work around the ancient god, which was mopping in the entry hall. The sun was starting to set over the ocean. Devlin could feel the dragon they were riding on start to buck a little. like a man who is twitchy after spending the whole day driving. They go nuts around sunset, he remembered. That had caused his uncle a lot of problems. Devlin didn't think it really mattered anymore, they had lost the jet. He had kept it flying for as long as he could, but eventually the wings had torn clear off, and they had lost the jet. That meant that the mission was over, the jet had been their edge, the one huge advantage they had had over everyone else. But it was gone, and that meant that the mission was basically over, and that meant he couldn't impress Charlotte's mother, and that meant no wedding. They hadn't managed to get the dragon to change its course or height since they had bailed out and landed on it. At least if it bucked long enough, then they would eventually reach ground level, or water level in this case. Devlin looked at Johnson. The man hadn't said a word since the jet had gone down, but then again neither had he. He tried to talk to him. "I blame you for this," he said. As a conversational gambit, it wasn't exactly the best, but then it had flowed so naturally off of his tongue, and it had the added benefit of being true. Johnson said nothing. He had been sitting on the edge of the dragon, staring down with his back to Devlin, for the last few hours. Devlin thought about the sun, sunset to sunset, he thought, that made it more than a few hours, and food was running out. Devlin was sure that the twitching he could feel under the dragon's skin was getting stronger. One way or another, he thought, it will all be over soon. He stood up and spread his arms. He imagined himself as a tragic hero, lost to a world which didn't understand him. Thinking these kinds of sad thoughts made him feel a lot better. He shut his eyes and breathed deeply through his nose, savoring the smell of the ocean breeze. Then something extremely fragrant blocked his nose. "Dude," said a strange voice by his ear, "surfing a bucking dragon, that's a crispy stunt, dude." Tony smiled in the pre-dawn glow as he woke up. After you have been sleeping on the ground for the last few nights, even a hard mattress is a little slice of heaven. Everything is relative. He felt the weight of Alice on his arm, and he smiled at her too. She had snuggled up to him last night, and Tony hadn't seen any reason to say no. He realized that he had grown quite fond of the girl. She had really helped out yesterday. The fires were out, and everyone who could be saved was now in a stable condition. They had done their part, and now the village was safe again. Tony felt gratified. He knew that Alice was clearly too young for him, but then he had met one of his ex-wives in much the same way, and he had had the same thoughts then too. The light was starting to get stronger. As the first clear rays brushed her face, Alice fluttered her eyelids and opened her eyes. Tony hoped he would have the opportunity to see her do that again. He found it very attractive. "Morning," he said. He could hear the smile on his voice, and it made him feel like laughing. "Morning," she smiled back at him. She moved to snuggle closer, but then seemed to think better of it and pulled herself into a sitting position. Tony noticed that Alice had been tired enough to get half undressed before going to sleep. She didn't seem to notice and, grinning like a hyena, Tony had no intention of telling her. "Nice dreams?" he asked. Alice turned to him and let her eyes roam up and down his body appraisingly. Tony wished that he had taken the time to get undressed before going to sleep too. "Very nice dreams," Alice said, with a tone in her voice which sent a flush of heat through Tony. Alice twitched like she wanted to get closer again, but again she seemed to think better of it. She did, however, pull herself around so that she was facing directly towards him. She brought her knees up and rested herself on them, like a little girl stretching. Tony had no objection. "What do you do, Tony?" she asked. Tony smiled. "I'm a reporter," he said. "What about you?" he asked, with genuine curiosity. Alice didn't really look, although she had expected to answer the question herself. She pouted at the ceiling. "I'm a hairdresser," she said. "Really?" said Tony, now surprised and curious. "What are you doing in the middle of the wildness?" He didn't think there would be much call for hairdressers in a vigilante army. Alice sucked on her bottom lip for a moment. "I was traveling with the Transylvanian vigilantes," she told him, "but, as you saw, the camp was blown halfway to smithereens, and I saw you running like you knew what you were doing. So now I'm here." Tony thought that her story missed the point completely, and rambled a bit. "What about you?" she asked, apparently relieved to turn the question back on him. What are you doing way out here? Tony didn't see much point in lying outright. I was traveling with some friends, all over the world, he said. No one could possibly dispute that. Itza looked around. Where are your friends then? I thought you were traveling alone. Tony shrugged. You know the way of things, hustle, bustle, and confusion, we got separated. Oh, said Alice looking a little disappointed. Do you know what happened to them afterward? Which really wasn't a guileful thing to say, thought Tony. I wonder who she's working for and why they want Greg. I really don't know, he said aloud, with a look of complete honesty on his face. I came across one of them in that army camp, but you saw how that turned out. She was in there? Asked Alice, looking alarmed. Oh my gods, is she all right? Obviously I can't say for sure, said Tony, feeling a little upset that he couldn't, but I'm sure that she'll be all right. Alice nodded a little, but she was staring at the wall to the side of Tony. Tony wasn't sure if it counted as giving information to enemy, but he couldn't bear to see Alice like this, so he told her the story that Gillespie had told him, the story of how Free Flower had ended up in Redrummer's army. By the end of it Alice was smiling again, and Tony was gratified. Thank you for telling me that, she said. She inched herself along so that she was a little closer to him, and started to run her hand up and down his arm in almost subconscious way. It was my pleasure, he said. I think it's a good quality of yours that you can care so much about the fate of someone that you've never met. He watched for some telltale blink to betray her, but nothing came. Apparently she really had never met Free Flower. Well, that was one clue to the puzzle at least. Alice pulled herself a little closer, and lay down next to him, holding his arm like a bed sheet. She closed her eyes again and rested her head on his shoulder. Tony didn't think that he had ever seen her look so good. He knew that he should really just let her rest, but in Tony's head certain thoughts had inertia, and he had wanted to do this all morning, ever since she had seen the mistake she had made undressing last night. You know, I'm not surprised that the army wanted you with them, he said. Alice didn't open her eyes, but she did smile and shift a little bit. Why? She asked, in the tone of voice that people use when they know that the punchline of a very funny joke is right around the corner. You're clearly a very good hairdresser, and I really mean that. Where I come from there are some people who would love to meet you, said Tony, half amused, half sincere. Oh, said Alice, flexing her body like a cat, and why do you think that? She was smiling more than ever now, and she was close enough that Tony could feel small ripples running through her body, as though she were already laughing. Well, when I first saw you, I was absolutely certain that you were a natural redhead, he said completely innocently. For a moment Alice didn't do anything. Then her eyes snapped open, her hand flew down, her eyes grew wider, her head turned down, her eyes got wider still, she sprang away, grabbed her pants, and was out the door. Tony laughed, great booming laughs, which shook the room. It was worth it, he knew. He hadn't guessed that the effect on her would be so strong. Even at the cost of her hanging off of his arm and flexing herself, it had been worth it. He pulled himself off of the thin mattress, and started dressing. He noticed that Alice had left a few items of clothing behind. He folded them neatly and put them in the middle of the mattress. He hoped that she remembered to put her pants on before she got too far. He didn't think the villagers would have ever seen a beautiful, half-naked woman running through their streets with two-tone hair before. Once he was dressed, he walked outside to greet the rising sun. All the critical work was done, he knew. But there was still a ruined village to rebuild. Tony met up with the men who were carrying lumber, and he got to work. Devlin let the wind flow through his hair, it made a whistling noise. He wasn't really sure what had happened, but the mission was sort of underway again. That didn't exactly make him feel happy, but it did make him feel a little bit better. He was sitting on the board of a windsurfer, and Devlin had decided that he would use their proper title from now on. They had saved him and he was grateful. He just wished they would stop offering him medicinal herbs wrapped in tinfoil. He knew that they were being hospitable. He thought that this probably counted as a high honor, but he had had enough of all that in college. Johnson was managing to stand up behind the windsurfer who was giving him a ride. Devlin wondered where he had learned to do that, certainly it was something he hadn't managed to do. He was sitting behind a man wearing the strange combination of a three-piece suit and a rainbow, nuclear disarmament headband. Devlin wondered how he was steering the board. He was holding it so steady that it was like sitting on the ground in a strong headwind. They were a long way up, still above the ocean, and that meant that he didn't really know how fast they were going, so he just relaxed and went with it. That seemed to be what Johnson was doing, and he looked positively joyful about this high-flying ride. Devlin nudged the man in front. "Where did you say you were taking us again?" he asked. "Like we said last night, man, you're off to see the wonderful mages of Oz, man. They can get you a nice new jet, man, and then you can do whatever it is that you were trying to do." Devlin tried to remember last night. He had a vague mental image of people dancing around a campfire, while someone played steel drums inside his frontal cortex. He decided to take the man's word for it. He suspected that he could have been told that he was a delicious variety of frog last night, and he would have just smiled and nodded. So Devlin thought about the mages. His instincts prepared a flight or fight response, but he beat them down. Go with it, he told himself. You're not going to get a nice structured mission on this one, so just go with it, and improvise. He still wasn't happy about the mages though. It was considered common wisdom that the only reason that school existed at all was so that all people who wanted to learn magic could be safely isolated from everyone else. When Devlin thought about it, the only good thing he had ever known to come out of the study of magic was the scrying crystals, and even they were unreliable for almost anything useful. Devlin was not an engineer of any kind, but he had a distinct feeling that the communication device you were relying on shouldn't be affected by the color of the shirt you were wearing. However, like the man said, they were off to see the mages. Devlin had been considering the odds of a group of windsurfers just stumbling across them in the middle of an ocean like they had. Someone up there likes us, he thought. Let's go find out how much they like us. Ernest Kank was having a very bad day. When he had woken up, he had stumbled out of bed and knocked his head against his wardrobe. Then when he had gotten downstairs for breakfast, he found that someone, process of elimination said it was him, had left his refrigerator door open. The motor had burned out and all his food had defrosted. This had meant that he had had to make do with warm apple juice and a steak from his freezer, which had turned out to be frozen on the inside when he had tried to bite into it. After this terrible breakfast, he had had his whole day made all the more worse by a call from Mr. Lucent, responsible businessman, and great supporter of the local police force. Mr. Lucent had directed him to a paper he had read called The Daily Soapbox and indicated that he would have a few questions to put to Ernest Kank, whenever he could find time in his busy schedule to do so. Ernest Kank had managed to track down a copy of the paper, which had required buying it off a teenage girl who he had thought had been far too flirtatious for his tastes. When he looked at the paper, he had found splashed across the front page a picture of his former logging enterprise, with the title Abuse of Power, Uprooting Innocence. He had compulsively ripped the paper into pieces and cast them on the wind, which then meant he had to go and buy another copy from the overly friendly 13-year-old, so he could read the article. The article was well written, and as well balanced as is possible, while stabbing a poison-tipped lance into him at every opportunity. He knew that it was inevitable that he would be discovered one day, though he had hoped for a few more years than this, but he had always taken comfort in the fact that it should have been incredibly difficult to find out that he was the man pulling the strings. Yet right on the third page was a giant picture of him and a short biography. He checked the writer of the article, Clare Summers. It read with great pride. Right, he thought. With a name he would need all of 5 minutes to track this, Clare Summers, down, and then after he had done that, he could contact one of the many men he kept around with guns and cash flow problems, and they would. No. That wouldn't work. The story would keep growing, and if the writer died then that would set tongues wagging, and then Ernest Kank would join the list of people who had lost everything through a bad reputation. He thought about what he should do next. He knew the next step in the process. It looked as though this Clare Summers had caught the other news agencies flat-foot. They would want to buy in, and she would sell to the highest bidder. As long as the story was localized to this small name paper, it could be overshadowed, but he would lose that ability the instant that the big papers got their hands on it. He knew that this was something he had to do personally, a telephone call would never suffice. Ernest Kank kept a bag of the things he needed for traveling in his lounge, in case he got called away suddenly. He grabbed it as he went past, on his way to the Amazon. Good gods, it was a 5-page article. Passport, toothbrushes, and a small Gatling gun, for hunting. Greg knew that the sun was probably high in the sky at this point, but it didn't bother him much. He was deep in the structure of the tower, but even if he could have seen the sun, it wouldn't have bothered him. Louise had said that she wouldn't be able to see him until after lunch. He was in one of the old dormitories, he had forgotten the name, and even if the sheets smelled a little musty, they were comfortable. He did remember the unofficial name of this dorm. When he had been a student, they had called it the dead dorm, and most of them had avoided it. They were avoiding it now, which meant that Greg had spent the night and morning in a deep, relaxing peace. He knew he should probably get up and go to do something. At the very least he should track down Crazy Sven and check that he wasn't getting into trouble, but he felt that that could wait a little bit. 5 minutes should be enough. Maybe a little bit more than 5 minutes. Time passed. Greg remembered why they called it the dead dorm, but he had never understood why everyone seemed to avoid it. Certainly it must be disturbing to have your magic switched off as soon as you entered the room, but it wasn't like they were relying on their magic anyway. No one with any sense relied on magic, it was just too unreliable. Greg noticed a sudden flash of light outside the doors of the dorm. That would be McClarky's buzz bell. He remembered that one. He didn't think it was likely that he would ever forget. Clark McClarky had been a teacher in Greg's brief time as part of the league. He had been so sick of students getting up late that he had arranged for a magic shock to run through every bed in the league tower at a certain time in the morning. The students weren't happy about this, of course, but they didn't have the ability to remove it, and all those with the ability to remove the spell were either too busy or too amused. After a while, it had become a tradition, and everyone just got used to getting out of and back into bed at a certain time in the morning. McClarky's buzz bell couldn't reach him in here, of course, but it did let Greg know how late in the morning it was getting. He should really get up soon. Any minute now. The world is of course filled with people who lack sense, and an extraordinary amount of last words had run along the lines of, "Never fear, I shall be safe, all thanks to my magi-guc-." Charlotte ran through the woods. She was panicking now. The hair which flicked in her face as she ran was turning from copper back to dull silver. She checked in every dark crevice she passed, but she must not have found what she was looking for since she kept running. She could feel her body starting to slim, it made her feel heavier somehow. Finally, she reached a huge cave with long streamers of moss falling down from the top of the mouth. With a huge broken smile on her face, she ran directly in. Something fluttered down past her face and she grabbed it with both hands. Shoving her prize in front of her face, she said to it, "I need to speak to Miss Alpha, please." The bat's head twisted around, looking for escape. But then it stopped, and it looked directly at her, and its eyes filled with far more cunning than a 12-pound flying rodent should possess. The cave suddenly filled with bats. They swarmed on Charlotte, like bathwater after the plug has been pulled out, and then suddenly, they all collapsed together, and Miss Alpha was standing there. "You're changing back," she said. Charlotte was panting, but she remembered her manners. "Yes, Miss Alpha," she said, "and thank you for seeing me, it is an honor." "That's all right, Miss Epsilon," said Miss Alpha. "Do you want me to change you again?" Charlotte nodded. She knew that the right time to withdraw from the mission was probably now. She didn't think that he knew where to find Mr. Greg, but she didn't want it to end just yet. Miss Alpha raised her hand again, palm out. Then she stopped. "Do you have chocolate?" she asked. "I like chocolate." Charlotte had been expecting Miss Alpha to lay out her terms since the bats had started to swarm, still chocolate wasn't what she had been expecting. She tried to think what Miss Alpha had meant, and then it came back to her. There was a chocolate statue at the center square of the town she had helped. She remembered being told that it had survived the fires, because it was never melt chocolate, a gift from the Magic League. She wondered what Miss Alpha wanted with a magic chocolate statue, probably not my place to know, she thought. I can get it for you, she said, the next time I need a top-up on the appearance spell. That's good, said Miss Alpha, and she pushed forward with the palm of her hand, like someone trying to move a fridge. Charlotte felt a huge surge of energy flow through her. She could feel her body filling out and her hair tingling as it changed form. She noticed that all her hair had changed. All well, she thought, I had told him I was a hairdresser. She felt the energy of the spell fade, and she fell to her knees on the floor of the cave. She was grinning a little bit, although she couldn't have told you why. She looked up, but the cave empty, and Miss Alpha was gone. It looked like the inside of a computer system, Greg thought, a computer system designed by alien sci-fi nerds with too much time on their hands. Louise's private lab gleamed and blinked with glowing lines everywhere. Had it been anyone else, then Greg would have just assumed that it was showing off for the benefit of tourists, but Louise didn't show off. All the glowing and blinking must have a purpose therefore, though Greg would be damned if he could work out what it was. Louses was standing in the center of the room. She was wearing a very fetching outfit made from silver fabric and glowing blue lines. She was mumbling to herself, and Greg knew better than to interrupt. Greg didn't trust magic, at all. It was one of the reasons that he had failed to make it as a mage. He didn't really trust the sighing crystals either, no matter how frequently they turned out to be safe. Magic had a way of saving itself up and biting when you didn't expect it. It was a living thing, you couldn't be sure how it would react. Still, the sighing crystals had been Louise's project. She had forced enough order into the unrestrained mayhem of the EML to actually make it do something useful. She was the expert, and if anyone could control them, it was her. Louise finished mumbling and lowered her arms. She turned slowly to Greg. It's ready, she said, now tell me again what I'm looking for. Greg blinked twice. It's a yellow crystal. It will be around his neck. You still have his cell phone number in your head? Louses nodded. I have a question for you, Greg, she asked. If you have his cell phone number, then why don't you just call him? I want this call to be private, Louise. I don't want anyone else eavesdropping. Are you going to expect me to cover my ears and hum quietly in the corner? It sounded like a joke, but it was really hard to tell with Louise. Just make the call. Greg said, please. Louise nodded and turned back to the center of the room. Do you know what color shirt he will be wearing? She called back over her shoulder. Blue, I think, said Greg. Louise nodded, and raised her arms again. The air in the room suddenly felt a lot heavier. When Tony saw the ghostly image of Greg walking towards him, he dropped the log he was carrying in shock. The log rolled down the hill and spooked a chicken. The chicken flew away, knocking a loaf of cooling bread off of a windowsill. The housewife saw what had happened to her bread, and she ran to get it, throwing her peg bag over her shoulder and causing pegs to scatter all over the road. A group of children saw the pegs and ran towards them in excitement. They ran straight across the road, which meant that old Mr. Johnson had to swerve to avoid them. Mr. Johnson's car was open top, so when he swerved to avoid the children, his old yellow cat flew out of the car. Tony was completely transfixed by the approaching apparition, which is why he didn't notice the flying cat until it hit him in the back of the head and took him to the ground. When Tony picked his head out of the dirt, Greg was still there. He smiled and offered Tony his hand. Tony didn't think he had ever seen him smile before. He reached up and tried to take Greg's hand, but it was like grasping at air, or possibly a supermodel. Tony let his eyes fall. Is this real? He asked. He felt warm and light-headed. He supposed that might be the result of the flying cat. Yes, Tony, said Greg, it's real. You should get up and try not to be so obvious with your speaking. You're the only one who can see me. You know, said Tony out of the corner of his mouth, you're really not helping your this is real case. But then he stood up anyway. Do you know where Free Flower is? Asked Greg. Hold on, said Tony, my question first. Why on earth didn't you call me? I mean, it must have been a week since we got separated, and you didn't even think to call? Greg raised his eyebrows. It looked like a deliberate action. I think our communication is being monitored, he said. Some of the things that have happened to us have been a little too convenient for my taste. Tony knew that was the answer. hell, he had even thought of it by himself. He didn't want to accept Greg's explanation, but he did so. Next question, he said, how you are a ghost now, are you a ghost now? Ghosts aren't real, Tony, said the vampire to the reporter. Greg smiled and sighed, all right, the way I'm doing this is by way of that crystal you keep wearing. Tony touched the yellow stone around his neck. Oh yeah, he said, I keep forgetting that I have this thing. Wait, since when do you know about sighing crystals? I don't, said Greg. He put a lot of emphasis on the next words, I still don't trust them. This little stunt needs an entire specialized room and the supervision of an expert to pull off. You know an expert? Asked Tony, raising his eyebrows. I know the expert, replied Greg, raising his own eyebrows in a slightly mocking manner. But to get back to my question, is free flour all right? Greg smiled, and then told Tony one of the strangest stories he had ever heard. It involved a man named Crazy Sven, who was apparently a crazy surgeon, but not a crazy German. Greg even rolled up his pant leg to show where his broken leg had apparently been splinted with duct tape. Tony shook his head. Your man sounds like a nutter, he said. Greg nodded. He didn't seem prepared to argue. What's the new plan? Tony asked. Greg looked up, and suddenly he was the hard-faced strategist that Tony had known. We can't meet up, he said, not if we're being watched. I'll have to lay low by myself. What did you say you were doing right now? Tony told him about the village, and how he had seen it burning, and blamed himself. Good, said Greg, stay and help out. I'll find some way to contact you again if I need you again. And Tony, the one really important thing I need you to remember is dash. Greg lurched as though he had been tackled, and the image faded. That was bad timing, thought Tony. Greg hit the ground hard. He hadn't been ready and hadn't braced himself at all. His head bounced off the cobblestone floor, and he felt his broken leg jar slightly. He's here, I don't believe it, Johnson, he's here, said a voice above him. Greg didn't even wait for his vision to clear. He snapped his body around and felt his fist connect with something fleshy, and then he slapped the ground and ran. He could feel his feet pounding on the ground, and he could hear the sound of his heart beating in his ears. He dodged around a gray-haired man who filled the doorway ahead of him, looking shocked. Don't let him get away, said the first voice, which sounded as though it was chewing on a large plum. Greg moved automatically, up the stairs, down the corridor, through the kitchens. His thoughts started to return to him, and he turned down the corridor that the experienced students liked to send the new ones through. He dodged, ducked, dipped, dived, and dodged, and suddenly he was on the other side. There was a cacophony of clanking armor behind him as his two pursuers had their progress impeded by a lynch mob. Greg almost slowed down, but then he heard a thudding noise as one of the men made it through. That's insane, Greg thought, I've never seen someone that determined before. He reached a stairwell and ran down 3 steps before just jumping clear over the edge. There has to be one here, he thought, let's see him get through this. He was in another corridor, and one door was open. There was the pentagram inside. Greg ran for it. His follower was about a second behind him. Greg crossed the circle, waving the basic protection runes in front of him. He made it to the other side without incident. Done it, he thought, pleased with himself. Then he turned around. While it is very hard to cross a pentagram if you don't know the protection runes, that isn't to say that it's impossible. 5 students in black robes, and the angel they were summoning all stared in amazement as Greg's pursuer tried to push himself into the circle against the force of a modest hurricane. The barriers are there for the user's protection. Greg didn't want to see how this ended. He took several shortcuts, and then he was running out of the entrance hall. He realized that Crazy Sven was running with him. Where did you come from? He asked. Ah, 'tis like you are, how you say? Bomb squad. You run, I run too. Something smashed out of the tower, riding a pillar of fire and screaming like a carnivorous chainsaw. Run faster! Greg yelled. Something short stepped into their path. The dwarf pointed his axe at them. Hello, it said, my name is Katakamatatama. You killed my father, prepare dash. Wondering when his life had gotten so weird, Greg dodged the dwarf and kept running. Charlotte was conflicted, and confused, and generally in two minds about everything. This was a fairly normal state for her, but this time was worse than usual. She had fallen for Tony, there didn't seem to be much point in lying to herself about that. She had fallen for Tony, but she was still in love with Devlin, and she didn't know what to do. The fact that she didn't know where Devlin was made it all the more worse. She wished she could find him, but no matter how she looked, there didn't seem to be any sign of him. He wasn't responding to any kind of phone call, or anything else for that matter. Men. Charlotte thought angrily. Then she corrected herself, human men. I bet the world was all nice and simple, before they showed up and made everything complicated. But angry thoughts didn't solve anything. It was getting late, the sun was starting to set. Tony would be going to bed soon, on that hard mattress, in a broken-down house, in the middle of a cocoa farming village, which was barely dignified with a name. He would want her to join him, she knew, and gods knew that she wanted to, but she was afraid that if she was by his side tonight, then she wouldn't be able to leave tomorrow. Paralyzed by indecision, Charlotte watched the sun go down. Clare was jerked violently out of sleep. She gazed around her tent, trying to force her blurry eyes to focus properly. It sounded like a helicopter, except louder, much louder. On second thought, it sounded as though a helicopter was beating the air into submission around it. Malfunction, Clare thought, but no, there was more than one helicopter. Sabotage, she thought, but no, they were getting closer. Somehow whatever was making that noise was flying and closing in on them. When she realized that they could expect company, Clare jumped out of bed like someone had just zapped her with an electric line. She darted around the tent, smoothing her hair with one hand, while pulling on yesterday's clothes with the other. That done, she stumbled out of the tent and looked up. It was helicopters, and they did seem to be flying by beating the air into compliance. Clare looked for a crest, or some sort of marking, but there was nothing. The helicopters were a neutral white, but Clare doubted that their purpose was entirely peaceful. They came in to land on the mess. The noise was incredible, Clare could feel her hair whipping her as it was blown back. The engine started to calm, and the blades started to slow, but before either had changed very much a man jumped out of the lead helicopter. He was a surprisingly tall man, and he had a ridiculous mustache. Clare knew the face. Ernest Kink, she said under her breath. She felt very nervous, she had never expected to meet the man in person. Kink was looking around the gathering crowd, he spotted her, and their eyes locked. He looked perfectly turned out, as though he had been dressed by his personal barber before stepping out of the helicopter. If he had, then it was definitely worth the effort, he radiated power. Clare was suddenly very aware that she hadn't brushed her teeth this morning. Kank walked away from the helicopters and towards her. The crowd parted before him like the Black Sea before a cruise liner. Clare knew that all eyes were on her. They don't know what to do, she realized, so they're waiting for me to make the decision for them. She didn't know what to do either, but that wasn't right, because a leader has to always know what to do. Pick something. She spread her arms wide in a gesture of welcome. Ernest Kink, she said, I'm glad to meet you. Kink reached her. He didn't loom, he just stood a respectable distance back and smiled. Claire Summers, he said, likewise. Then, just like that, the baseline had been set. Claire wondered just where this was going to lead. This is going to suck, Charlotte thought. Miss Alpha drove a very hard bargain, the people of the town seemed to love the statue. The town had suffered an almost direct hit from an air-to-air missile, and everything in the center square had burned down, apart from the fireproof statue. It wasn't even a good statue, Charlotte thought, there is a limit on what even the finest sculptor can do with chocolate, and every single member of the family that the statue depicted was cross-eyed. But the people loved it, they brought wreaths of flowers and laid it at the base, it was their symbol of defiance against the world, and more specifically, the parts of it that would be willing to attack them. Charlotte felt a slightly calloused hand rest on her shoulder. She laid her own hand over it. "Hey Tony," she said. Tony sat down beside her. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" he said. He had a kind of glow about him. Charlotte's brow corrugated for a moment. He couldn't mean the statue surely, she thought. She let her eyes wander out a bit. "The buildings," she guessed. "Yeah," sighed Tony, "they get knocked down, and 3 days later they're going up again. This village is resilient." Charlotte was a little more cynical. "Pity about it not being fireproof," she said. Tony made his thoughtful face. "You know, I was talking to one of the village elders about that. Apparently they're going to use the spaces between the walls to store water, this time round." Charlotte thought about this. "Won't that make it cold in the winter?" she asked. "Hells yes," said Tony, "it doesn't seem to bother them much." Charlotte let herself rest against him. He smelled like sweat and charcoal. "Anyway," he was saying, "there is one part of the village which is fireproof." Charlotte took her head away and looked at him. She didn't like where this was going. "That statue," he clarified, mistaking her look for a question. "It's a really silly-looking statue, isn't it? But they've turned it into such a symbol. I was working on the new town hall, and I asked one of the men where the foreman was, and he pointed at the statue. Everyone laughed, of course, but I think we're all glad that the statue is here." Charlotte buried her head in his chest, fighting the urge to cry. It wasn't fair, she thought. If I don't take the statue I turn back and have to leave. If I do take it everyone will be demoralized and I'll want to leave. She wrapped her arms around Tony and tried to imagine holding him there forever. He wrapped his arms around her too. She hadn't cried, she was sure of that, but he seemed to understand. If she had been able to see his face, she was sure he would look utterly befuddled. Devlin was in two minds about absolutely everything. This wasn't normal for him. He always saw dozens of alternatives beckoning him away from whatever task he had undertaken, but the way forward was always clear. The way was always to stick to the mission, to follow the goals. He was still thinking like that, but now he seemed to have two missions. The first was familiar: find Mr. Gregg, stop him from being present for the reading of his uncle's will, win Charlotte's mother's approval, and marry Charlotte. The second mission was new. He thought it was new. It was pulling him along too, and it was strong. It seemed to involve seeking out evildoers and smiting them. It didn't seem to come with a way to complete the mission. Presumably he was just meant to keep doing it until he ran out of evildoers. He could fly now as well. He wasn't sure when that had happened. He had a vague idea that this was something he had always done, but he didn't have any memories to support that idea. Devlin was confused and tired, and he didn't know what had happened. There are certain instincts that all humans have, and the instinct to go home when we are hurt is one of the strongest. Devlin didn't really have a home. He felt absolutely no love for the house he had grown up in, but an image did form in his mind. He felt pressure between his shoulder blades, like someone giving him a friendly shove out the door, and the landscape started to his past. There was the jet, or the husk of it anyway. Devlin realized that he had never given the jet a name. That seemed like a real oversight now. A living thing deserves a name, and Devlin had thought about the jet as being alive. It was all too late now, he thought. It may have been alive, but now it very dead. He let himself fall towards it. As his feet touched the fuselage, he felt a lot of the worry leave his mind. He was safe here. He sat down and felt the heat of the metal hull. Nature was already taking it back, he saw. The joints where the wings had been were blossoming a furry coating of rust, and enterprising creeper plants were climbing over any place low enough to reach. Devlin didn't really want to stop it. The same thing would happen to him one day. "I knew you'd come here," someone said. "You took much longer than I thought you would." Devlin did bother to turn around. He had been wondering when he was going to see Johnson again. "What do you want?" he asked. He was feeling moody, and he wasn't sure whether he wanted to talk to Johnson or to be left alone. "You're my partner," said Johnson. "I felt it was my job to come and find you." That answer seemed very suspicious to Devlin. It sounded like it was tailored to his own thoughts. He wasn't really sure of his own thoughts anymore. "Well, now you've found me," he said. He didn't say anything else. Johnson was still standing behind him. "Do you want to know what happened to you back at the tower?" he asked. Devlin thought this was a stupid question. He nodded glumly. "Apparently," said Johnson, "the students were trying to summon a cherub. They managed it, but then you broke into the circle and it possessed you." Devlin remembered the felling of hot lead being forced down his spine and didn't say anything. "The cherub has to leave voluntarily, and according to what they told me, once an angel has a toehold in this world it won't leave voluntarily. So there's really no cure." Johnson watched for a reaction to this bad news. Devlin didn't respond at all, he didn't even move. "The cherub should be affecting your mind apparently," Johnson pressed on. "Are you feeling more violent and vengeful?" Devlin moved his head slowly, he might have been nodding. Johnson sounded like he had given up. "I'll be waiting inside the jet," he said, "in case you return from Catatonia." He waited for a response, but when none came, he walked away. Devlin sat where he was and felt the heat of the sun. Clare strided out of her tent. She was beaming. In her mind's eye, she saw herself, whipping hair, framed against the sunset. This is an adventure, she thought, negotiating successfully with a borderline hostile opponent. Mr. Kank exited the tent after her. He was smiling slightly too. She thought that was a good sign. Both of them were walking away happy. She walked with him back to the choppers, and was gratified to see all the pilots scrambling to get back before they did. Many people had just been waiting around for them to appear, and that made her feel like a rock star. People were actually standing on each other's shoulders to get a better look at her. "Don't let it go to your head," she warned herself. "If this man thinks that he can take advantage of you, then he will crush you like a bug." She kept herself alert, watching her companion for any sign of what he was thinking. She had watched him back in the tent as well. He had been looking for any sign of weakness from her, but then he had stopped. She didn't think she had shown any weakness. Even while she was alert she was happy. She felt as though she had completed some kind of life's goal, which she had never known she had. The sunset was golden, and its light spilled over Mr. Kank's monstrous helicopters like molten gold. Mr. Kank put his first foot on the rung of the helicopter stairs, and then he turned and extended his hand. Now Clare felt like a world leader. "This place is filled with reporters," she thought. "I hope someone takes a picture of this." She took his hand and they shook. His hand was surprisingly soft. Then he was in the helicopter and was disappearing into the sunset. Clare watched until the helicopters had almost disappeared. Then she noticed Frankie and Andrew standing to either side of her. "My loyal lieutenants," she thought. "Had a nice day, boys?" she asked, the way she had used to in high school. "Yes, sir," said Frankie. "What are our new orders, sir?" Clare was amused that he had assumed that there would be new orders. There were, of course, but she hadn't given it away. "Collect everyone together," she said. "We're going home." "Oh, and boys? Tell everyone to expect a huge bonus." Charlotte had excellent night vision. Even in the darkness of the cloud-covered night, she could see the statue clearly in the middle of the square. She had spent the best part of a day trying to find some alternative to taking the statue, but she had thought of nothing. What it came down to in the end was this: she wanted to stay with Tony, and that would mean taking some risks. She couldn't let him see her in her normal form. No one else was around. The village was still relying on candles for light, and it was a waste of candles to stay up late routinely. Everyone else was asleep. Charlotte had the village all to herself. She ran for the statue. No one could possibly have seen her, even if they were looking out the window at this moment. Still, she didn't feel comfortable out in the open. She reached the statue and grabbed at it. It felt as though her arms were being wrenched out of their sockets. "Ah," thought Charlotte, "not my body, I'm not as strong as I'm used to." Charlotte let herself fall to a sitting position at the base of the statue. She had spent all her time wondering whether to steal the statue, and hadn't really considered the actual mechanics of how. Now that she thought about it, Charlotte wasn't sure that she could have taken the statue away even with her strength. It was probably bolted to the ground, and she didn't know how strong it was. She wouldn't want to break it. Charlotte wasn't good at working to a goal, and she almost quit right there, but something made her keep going. It was a cold night, and she desperately wanted to snuggle in with Tony, but she had to do this now. Charlotte stood back up and looked around. I'll need to make some sort of pulley, she thought. Tony woke up late. He was doing that more and more, he found. He didn't understand at first why he had woken up. He had woken up very suddenly, and he was sure there should be a reason. He then became aware of a huge amount of noise around him. It was like the town had declared a party. He thought this was very rude of them. Tony liked parties, but he generally liked them when he was awake and well rested. After all, it was very early in the morning, and he had been having his favorite dream, the one about the bagpipe-playing octopus. Far too slowly, other important parts of his brain came back online. That wasn't a party outside, or at least it wasn't the kind of party that Tony liked. The people sounded far too angry. Tony staggered away from his mattress, pulling his shirt over him. The kitchen was deserted as he walked through it, and that was odd. Old Mother Grandma's never left her kitchen. He got out of the front door, and got no further. He hadn't realized just how many people lived in the village. Everyone was outside, and everyone was angry. At least they're not angry at me, he thought. He looked around for Alice, but he couldn't see her, and red hair should really stand out in the crowd. He knew that she had gone to sleep next to him. She must have gotten up first, he decided, while the mob was still forming. He hoped she would be all right. He didn't know how well she could look after herself. He looked around for what was powering the mob, but the people stretched around the corner, and out of sight. He nudged an old woman, who he vaguely recognized from the village's cocoa forges. "What's going on?" he asked. The old lady turned to him. She didn't seem as angry as the others, but there was something which Tony found terrifying about her eyes. They were eyes that were already witnessing an execution. "They say it's the statue," she said. "They say that someone has taken it, or so they say." Tony was shocked. He said what, but he had heard he the first time round, and at any rate he didn't wait for an answer. He thought about how he could get to the front of the crowd. He couldn't push his way through, the people were standing far too close. He couldn't walk over the top of the people, even if they were dense enough. He still didn't think it was a good idea to antagonize these people right now. He thought about the advantage he had over the rest of the people here, and he rushed back inside. There was a thing in the kitchen which was a little too small to be a window, and a little too well framed to be a hole that someone had punched in the wall. Its primary purpose was to let smoke out, but Tony guessed that he would fit through it if he wiggled a little bit. He propped himself up on the stove, being careful to avoid the hot cooking plate, and squeezed through the smoke hole. He was directly above the mob now, and looking down on someone's bald spot. He turned himself through a 180-degree turn, breathing in at the corners, and reached up to grab at the roof. He pulled himself up, willing the rather weak tiling not to break, and sent him falling. It didn't break, and panting slightly, Tony pulled himself up on the roof. He got to his feet and looked. There were a few others on other roofs who had had the same idea he had had, but mostly he was alone, and he had an unobstructed view. The statue was really gone, and the mayor, or at least the man who wore a funny wig and liked to give orders, was standing on a podium and addressing the crowd. He was talking about putting together teams of search parties to comb the countryside until they found the statue. Tony liked that idea. He thought he might have some ideas about where to start looking. Johnson didn't like Charlotte. He thought that she was a manipulative and silly little girl. Nevertheless, there was no denying that his partner was in love with her, and Johnson was an old enough man to know the importance of admitting when you were in over your head. He had tried to communicate with Devlin again last night, and again this morning. As far he could tell, Devlin had not done as much as move a muscle in all that time. He knew that he had met his match, and that was why he had brought out the organizational directory. Officially, the organizational directory didn't exist, then again officially, the organization didn't exist. The reasoning was the same in both cases. In the case of the organization, it didn't exist because the ladyship didn't want it under government scrutiny. In the case of the organizational directory, it didn't exist because the people in the organization didn't want her ladyship scrutinizing their private communications. Johnson let his thumb scroll down the index until he found Charlotte's secure telephone number. He typed her private number into his phone and then let his eyes rest on the screen for a moment while his thumb hovered above the final button. No other way, he thought, and then he pressed dial. The phone rang. Then it rang some more. It was continuing to ring, and Johnson was just considering stopping and dialing again, when suddenly the ringing stopped, and he heard Charlotte's voice on the other end. "Hello," it said. Johnson paused for a moment and considered the facts. Charlotte sounded out of breath, and he could clearly hear the sound of a stream behind her words. He filed these facts away for later pursuit, and started to speak. "Devon has been possessed by an angel," he said. He could feel the panic blossoming on the other side of the phone. "Oh my gods," said Charlotte, "is he okay?" "He's gone catatonic," Johnson said. He didn't like having to ask for help from someone half his age. "He needs you here." Then after a brief internal struggle, he added, "I haven't been able to talk him out." "I'll be there, I'll come, I'll help," spluttered Charlotte. "Just tell me where you are." Johnson fed her the coordinates. He could now hear a whooshing sound and the thudding of running feet. It's going to be a long trip if she is going to run the whole way, he thought. He remembered something important that he should have told her. "Listen, Charlotte," he said, "there's something important I've realized. I think that dash." But he never got any further. A huge spark arced from the plane and earthed itself in his ear. He dropped the phone in shock. There were sparks leaping from every metal surface in the jet. They lit the cabin with an unpleasant light, and they made the air fizz. Devlin walked into the cabin. He was crackling with electricity, and his eyes were glowing with a harsh white light. "We have delayed too long," he said. His voice was still human, but now it had the certainty of a man who knows that if the world does not conform to his will by itself, then he can simply force it to. "We are going to continue our mission to capture Mr. Gregg." "Capture?" asked Johnson, who thought that this was a positive sign. "And then we shall judge him. The unholy shall be burned until they are pure." Johnson thought that this course of action would be likely to leave someone crisp, but not really pure. He attempted reason. "We don't know where Mr. Gregg is," he pointed out. "We know where Mr. Thompson is." "That's not exactly true. We know where the tracking device is, but that thing was heavy and unwieldy. He's probably dropped it somewhere by now," said Johnson. He was surprised by how calm he felt. Maybe he didn't really expect to live through this. Devlin seemed unimpressed. Johnson tried reason one last time. "We can't follow the signal," he said. "The jet won't fly without any wings." Devlin was perfectly still, but the electricity never stopped. Just when he thought that Devlin had achieved a particularly energetic state of catatonia, Devlin lifted his right arm. He put his hand palm first against the wall of the jet. The sparks all around Johnson got a lot more intense. It was painful to touch anything, and he swore that the plane was glowing. He looked out of the windshield. The ground was getting further away. "Why are we finding Mr. Thompson?" he asked, mostly to himself, but Devlin answered anyway. "To extract the information we want," he said. Sparking like a malfunctioning bug zapper, and moving like a saucer would if you skipped it across the water, the jet flew into the sunset. This was a bit unwise on Johnson's part. Everyone tries reasoning with the monster first, despite no one being able to remember it ever working. Lord Greenbadger had a very impressive library. He didn't really like to read, but he liked information. He loved information. This wasn't the library that he let his guests see, of course. He liked to keep his information private. After all, it was his greatest edge. He kept a token library in his living room, and he invited his guests to read from it. It contained all the books that a gentleman of his standing was expected to possess, and as such it was very respectable. But if you knew where the secret catch was, then behind it there were many older books. He dragged the old wooden ladder along the shelves. There wasn't much room between the shelves, and he had to hug it close. When he had reached the section that he wanted, he climbed up and pulled a single book out from the throng. He held it close to his chest. This was the book that he wanted. There was a single desk away from the shelves, and there was a reading light on it. He laid the book on the desk and sat down on the chair. Then he turned the light on and studied the book. It was a heavy book, clearly old, and important since it had been bound in leather. The writing on the front had faded, but he could still make it out when he looked at it out of the corner of his eye. It read, "Furious Angels, and How to Avoid Them." The town was happy again, and Tony was glad to see it. There was still talk about tracking down the people who had stolen the statue and stringing them up by the smallest available body part, but now it seemed good-natured, like one might scold a child. It had been surprisingly easy to find the statue. That was a good thing. There had been talk of calling in mercenaries to join the search, and that had worried Tony, who had dealt with mercenaries before and didn't think he had enough money to make them stop fighting afterwards. But there was no need to worry about that anymore. The thief had left the statue right out in the open, just sitting by a picturesque mountain stream. Tony didn't quite know what to make of that. He thought that maybe the thief had realized what was coming after him, and decided to cut his losses. He didn't really think that it was likely, but he couldn't help giggling whenever he imagined a shady man with a mask looking back at the pitchfork-wielding mob and then running for his life. He didn't know exactly where Alice was. He hadn't seen her since the disappearance of the statue, and he couldn't help but suspect that the two things were related. He worried that whoever had taken the statue had kidnapped her as well, but he dismissed his worries as groundless. It would be impossible to find anyone in the mob he was traveling in, everything was too disorganized. She probably was around and he just hadn't seen her. Besides, if the thief had dropped the statue, then he would have certainly left behind a live human. Tony had done a little smuggling in his time, and though he had never tried to move a protesting person, he felt sure that it would be far more difficult than moving even the heaviest statue. Of course, a released person would tell your trackers where you were going and what you looked like. Unless they couldn't carry a tail. Dead men told no tales, they were proverbial for it. Before Tony could pursue this new line of worrying, someone clapped him on the back, and said something hearty in a language that Tony didn't understand. This was their victory. This a victory which belonged to all of them, even if in this case they hadn't actually done much work. Word had spread and all the other search parties were joining them, like a dozen feeder streams, all leading into one great tide of humanity, which surged back towards the village. Someone seemed to have declared a party, a big one. Tony was surprised and gratified. Their village burns to the ground, he thought, and they celebrate anyway. Huge bottles of beer were being passed around, along with, surprisingly, slabs of chocolate. There were banners and streamers in dozens of bright color, and someone had managed to collect together 36 rusty saxophones. Tony passed one on when it came his way, but the man next to him took up the challenge, and soon the mob was marching to music that was, if not very good, then at least upbeat and enthusiastic. People were getting into it as well. To Tony's left, a man old enough to be his father was turning cartwheels in time with the music. On his right, a woman of the sweet old grandma mold was using the edge of a battle axe to lever the cork off of a beer bottle. A little in front and to the right, a nubile young girl was looking backwards and giving the look in Tony's direction. Tony was gratified, and was about to give the look back, when he realized that her eyes were aimed at the cartwheeling man next to him. Tony laughed out loud, and silently wished them the best of luck. Someone had pressed something clear in a bottle into his hands, and Tony had been sipping it for a few minutes. So when he first saw the black pointy thing slipping across the sky like an escaping bar of soap, he put it down to high spirits. It really had been a pitchfork-equipped mob. They had had flaming torches as well, and Tony could have sworn that he had seen at least one person with a battle axe. Johnson looked down through the screen. It was flicking a little bit, but there was no mistaking what it showed. He left it behind, he said. It looks like some sort of army camp down there. There are lots of scorch marks around, so they probably evacuated fairly quickly. Devlin didn't say anything, or move at all. He didn't seem to move much anymore. Johnson pressed on. He probably left his pack behind. It's a newbie mistake, but then he was never a soldier. Or he might have taken it out to lighten his load. A decorative piece of melted metal isn't exactly the kind of thing that you would call a vital piece of equipment. Devlin didn't move now either, but Johnson thought that his eyes looked less intense than they had earlier, like his partner had checked out from behind them. Johnson was sweating a lot. He didn't really like electrically, or at least he didn't like it now. There weren't many views that Johnson clung to with real certainty, but he was on the verge of making the view that electricity's place was inside wires or in kitchen appliances, one of them. Sparks were still leaping back and forth inside the cabin, and Johnson had been shocked so many times that he was almost used to it. Almost. He decided to press on, hoping that he could get his message across. Whether he left it deliberately or accidentally doesn't really matter. The important information to take away here is that Mr. Thompson isn't here, and that we have no idea where he is. Devlin didn't respond to this either. His eyes still looked blank. Would you like to land and look around? Johnson asked, with more than a little disrespect in the tone. Trying to communicate with Devlin was frustrating him. Devlin moved now. It was so slow that it wouldn't normally have warranted a reaction from Johnson, but after hours of stillness Johnson jumped at the movement. All the sparks flared up as well in apparent response. Devlin walked to the windscreen and looked out. Johnson noticed that the eyes were harsh and alert again, like windows to an empty universe. He tried to see what Devlin was looking at, but he didn't see anything very noticeable. There, said Devlin, he is in the parade. We will go there. Parade? Thought Johnson. He looked in the direction that Devlin was looking in. When he really started to focus, Johnson could just make out a thin ribbon of color hidden away in what looked like another mountain entirely. They were too far away for Johnson to even be sure that it was people, let alone a single person in the middle of a parade. He didn't really think it looked like people. But it didn't seem to matter what he thought. The jet was moving again, and whether he liked it or not, he was coming along for the ride. It had been a very long helicopter ride, and customs had been much too thorough for Claire's liking. She had hoped that her visit to the office would be a brief one, purely to serve notice that she was back in the country and that she would be happy to come in to get some work done, after she had had some sleep. She wasn't so lucky though. Almost before the lift doors opened, Clare heard Sandra call out to her from the front desk. Rowan said that he wants to see you at your earliest convenience. Claire still remembered how empathetically Sandra had stated her views on abandoning work, and she waited to hear the smug tone in her voice, but it wasn't there. That worried Claire. She wondered just how angry Rowan was if her friend through a steel door was too concerned to gloat over something. She nodded and started to walk towards the corridor that held the editor's office. Frankie and Andrew had followed her up in the lift. As she walked away to the right, Frankie walked to the left, rejoining the mass of reporters like he had never left. Andrew stood there looking scared and confused, which was his usual expression. Sandra jerked her head, and he darted gratefully behind the desk. Claire noticed that while he looked as scared as ever, his run was more measured and he kept his head held high. But there was no time to wonder about the change that had overtaken Andrew. Claire walked down the corridor and found the editor's office. She opened the door and walked in, remembering to knock halfway through. The office looked almost exactly the same as when Greg had inhabited it, but now Rowan was sitting at the desk, in a huge leather executive chair that made Claire think of fighter jets. The chair had been the only piece of furniture that Rowan had brought with him, and Claire wondered why he was so attached to it. Rowan had also brought a pipe with him. Claire had never seen him smoke it, and neither had anyone else that he had talked to. Apparently chewing on it just helped him think. He was chewing on it now, while glaring at Claire and not saying a word. Claire took the hint and sat down. "What kind of a stunt did you think you were pulling, Miss Summers?" Rowan opened. If Claire had been standing, she would have taken a step back from the force of the rebuke. Rowan was short-tempered and emotional. He was notorious for it, but he had never spoken to Claire like that before. Claire ran through several responses, most of them were rephrasing of going to get a get story for the paper. She spent too long deliberating, and Rowan cut in with a different question. "Do you have any idea what kind of a situation you've set off here?" "No," said Claire by way of answering. She really had no idea what her editor could be talking about. With an irritable jerk of his hand, Rowan sent a newspaper sliding in her direction across the table. He had clearly been keeping it close at hand. With a furrowed brow, Claire picked up the paper. It was the USA Today, which was odd. She had agreed not to sell her information to anyone. The paper should have nothing to go on. She unfolded the paper. It had a giant picture of her on the front, looking very noble, and the caption read, "Lone voice silenced, is this too much?" Tony felt the searing sensation press into him again. It was too much, his mind went blank. He knew that he was yelling again, his throat felt raw and ripped, he just hoped it was only swear words that he was yelling, rather than anything that could be used against him later. The pain stopped again, and Tony could hear the sound of crackling meat. He reviewed the last few seconds of this life, and couldn't remember giving anything away. There was a man standing not too far away, he was shivering slightly and had the look in his eyes that people get when they're watching a car crash. Tony wondered why he wasn't helping him, although he supposed that the bystanders didn't always help out at car crashes either. The only other man there was the man who had tried to convince them that he was an FBI agent. Except that he wasn't the same as last time. Last time, he hadn't been so blank and ruthless, and Tony couldn't help a mad little smile, so sparkly. The man spoke again. "Where's Mr. Gregg?" he asked. Tony was silent. The first time the man had asked Tony had brushed him off with what he had thought was a fairly witty remark. The times after that he had just screamed that he didn't know. Now he was just hoping that silence was the right answer, or at least not the wrong answer. It didn't work, of course. The man pressed his hand into Tony's face again. Tony felt the searing again. It felt like having his face forced into a vat of burning petrol, which slipped through his eyes to the back of his throat, and then sunk to his center where it spread out and consumed him. The pain seemed to go on for much longer this time, though it was hard to judge time from the inside. When it lifted Tony realized to his shame that he could remember saying the words, "Magic League" and "the Master." "No," he said, through a hoarse throat, wishing more than anything that he could take his last words back. The man said nothing, he just turned around, Tony apparently not worth his attention anymore. As the jet began to move, the sunset cast disturbing shadows on him. Gregg looked down the gorge. It was a sheer cliff going down a very long way, and at the bottom a fast-moving river carved its way across the landscape. It had foam on it. Gregg shook his head. Fording the gorge just wasn't an option. He turned his attention back to Crazy Sven, who was still arguing with the troll. Gregg had tried to explain that there was no point in arguing with a troll, but Crazy Sven seemed to see that as a challenge, to yell louder. "Look to me, ya big little girl," said Crazy Sven, "I am not being, how you say? Arsehole, these are being apples." Gregg thought that was stretching the truth a little bit. Crazy Sven was offering Macduff's apple pies to the troll. They were warm, a fact that Gregg chose not to speculate on. Gregg settled back against an old pillar, which didn't seem to be supporting much. He knew that they were wasting time, but at this point, they seemed to have an infinite amount of time to waste. He didn't think it could go on for much longer anyway. Crazy Sven had been yelling at the top of his lungs for the last half hour, and his voice would surely break soon. Gregg became aware of an old man walking along the edge of the gorge. He took a closer look at the man, wondering when his brain had decided that harmless-looking old men were more interesting than a huge man of unclear nationality hurling abuse at a troll. The man looked up and met his gaze. He was a dignified-looking old man, like a county gentleman with his estate somewhere else at the moment, and his eye contact was steady. Apparently the man also considered Gregg more interesting than the altercation that was happening on the bridge. Gregg wondered what sort of life he had led. The man pulled level with Gregg and stopped. There was a long moment where the two just watched each other, neither willing to give anything away. Then the man nodded, and leaned against the pillar next to the one that Gregg was resting on. Gregg made no move to stop him. "Good day to you," said the man. Gregg nodded and said, "Good day." Then he turned back to Crazy Sven and the troll. The other man did the same. They stood like that for a small moment, each just watching the scene in front of them, without apparently paying attention to the person next to them. Then finally, the man spoke. "If I may ask, how did this happen?" he asked. Gregg thought it was a reasonable question. After all, it wasn't something you saw every day. He answered, "We were driving along this road and we came across this bridge. We want to go to the other side, but the troll that's guarding it wants his weight in apples before he will let us across." The man turned his head slightly to take in the taxi parked just before the bridge, and then he turned his head back to the troll. So as a result, your partner is trying to convince him that a McDuff's apple pie is much the same thing? Yes. I do believe that's stretching the truth a bit. Yes. A thought seemed to come to the man. I was under the impression that trolls' ears are pitched too low to even hear human speech. Greg nodded slowly, his eyes still on the bridge. That's right, he said, and it works in reverse as well. The speech that trolls use to communicate is too low for humans to pick out. And your partner is aware of this? Asked the man, his forehead creasing. Yes. Then why is he attempting to yell at it? Greg shrugged. In the time I'd have known Crazy Sven, I have come to realize that it's often better not to ask questions that start with why. The man nodded. Perhaps so. Where were you attempting to get to? He asked. Greg thought that this was a rather personal question, but something told him that he could trust this man. There's a town not too far from here, he said, founded by Lord Red Fox. I was planning on heading in that direction. The man nodded. Fox Vision. I've been there once or twice, a nice place I thought. But now you have found yourself stuck, because you cannot cross this bridge? Yes. The man seemed about to say something, but then another thought seemed to drive the first out of his mind. If you can't communicate with him, then how do you know what he desires as a toll? Greg indicated towards a large sign sitting in front of the bridge. It had large letters painted on it, which looked like they had been painted on by someone who couldn't really write, but who were copying the letters from another piece of paper. The sign read, "Toll for troll, 1 troll weight in apples." The man looked at the sign in confusion, and then he hopped down from the pillar and walked up to it. He stopped in front of the sign and looked at it in confusion. Then he walked around to the back of the sign in confusion. Then, without much confusion, he started to wrench the sign out of the ground. Greg thought that the dissonance was hurting his brain. The man looked to Greg like a grandpa of the dignified but kind mold, suited to giving gentle encouragement and advice to his grandchildren, or maybe just sitting on his deck with a glass of fine champagne and admiring his rose garden. Heavy physical labor simply didn't suit him. The sign was rammed hard into the earth, and Greg could see the sweat beading on the man's forehead while he wrenched at it. Greg didn't really think that the sign would be parting with the earth for anything less than heavy earth-moving equipment, but to his great surprise, the dignified-looking man gave a huge grunt, and the sign came away. Greg wondered what was going to happen next. He watched as the man turned the sign around and planted it back in the ground, rather more gently than it had been before. Greg forgot himself and stared. There was writing on the other side of the sign as well. It read, in rather neater writing, "We are pleased to inform you of the opening of a new toll-less bridge to ease travel through this region. You will find it approximately 1 kilometer to the left of this sign along the gorge. Many thanks and a safe journey, Gillespie the bridge builder." Claire woke up late. Her house was a mess, and smelled slightly of unwashed dishes. She had a groggy feeling in her head and an uneasy feeling in the pit of her stomach, but at least I'm not tired anymore, she thought. There had been a full debrief for Whirlwind last night. He had been very upset about a lot of the things that she had done. He wouldn't fire her, she was sure of that, mostly sure of that, though he had kept coming back to the thought that the difference between genius and hubris is success, and success is an unreliable thing. Anyway, he had gotten a bit better when she had pointed out the paper's share of the payout, which was now in their accounts, but only a little bit better. Whirlwind was one of those people who believed strongly in journalistic ethics. Claire got a glass of water from the sink and gargled with it, before spitting it away. Whirlwind had suggested that it might be a good idea not to come into work today, and that if at all possible, she should prevent the other news outlets from knowing that she was back in the country. Claire thought that he was just being paranoid, and she decided that she would definitely be in for work today, although she had every intention of being in a little late, owing to her need to recover from her stressful expedition. Claire smiled to herself and pushed her hair around. She could feel that it was a tangled mess, but it didn't really matter. She had known that she would have to wash it since she had come back from the Amazon. Before she did anything else, she wanted to get a look at today's paper, to see if they had forgotten about her already. This was when the whole thing went a little bit nuts. Reporters came from everywhere, jumping out of vans or out of bushes, or simply jumping. There were so many cameras going off that Clare felt like she was in the middle of a fireworks factory. And absolutely everyone and everything was collapsing onto her, like water rushing to fill a hole in the ocean. Clare didn't have the hard-won survival instincts of Tony, and so she just stood there, mouth gaping. When, at the last possible moment, she slammed the door, she could hear the sounds of several people running head first into it. Then there was only the sound of their questions, so many questions that it sounded like a particularly aggressive brook. Clare sunk to her knees, her legs apparently checking out for the day, and she listened with numb horror to the sound cutting through her walls and spreading through her whole house. Then her instincts finally caught up with her. She moved quickly back into the house, making sure to duck under windows. She made it back to her bedroom and pulled on a baggy jumper. Before pulling her phone down from her bedside table and calling the one person that she thought might be able to help her now. The phone crackled and spat, and then a voice sounded down the line. "Hello," it said. Clare was so relieved to find that she recognized this voice. "Sandra," she said, clinging to the voice like a lifeline. "Sandra." "Clare, is that you?" asked Sandra. "Do you have any idea what you've unleashed, girl? I've been fielding calls about you all morning. I think I might have a world leader on hold." Clare sank against her bedside cabinet. "Sandra," she managed to say, "I think that I've gotten in way over my head." Sandra laughed, and Clare was reassured to notice the gleeful edge to her tone. "Damn right you have, girl, but don't worry, Mama Sandra is going to make this all better, and maybe next time you'll follow my advice." "You say he's coming back? Why? How can you be sure?" "Very well, what else do you have to tell me?" "I see, I'll see what I can do. Goodbye." Louise dropped the phone back into the cradle clumsily. She was not used to using phones. The tower had its own methods of communications. She sat back in her chair and rubbed her temples. It was enormously unfair being the only sane woman in a virtual asylum. It meant that she was the go-to girl if anything actually needed to be accomplished. Apparently now, there was an angel lining up to attack her tower. That was sheer arrogance, she thought. An angel, a mere lesser cherub, thought that it could attack the EML. Well, it would soon find that even if mages didn't make the best soldiers, they still made dangerous opponents if they were given the right motivation. She walked out of her office and swept a hand behind the door, coming up holding a small yellow cat, which blinked at her, too shocked to react in any other way. She held the cat by the scruff of its neck, and pulled it closer to her face. "I'm sure you heard all of that," she said. "Contact the Rat Kings, and have them use their subjects to pass on the message to all the students. Tell them that the student who successfully destroys the angel will have unlimited free peanut oil for the remainder of the year." The cat almost looked as though it nodded. Louise put it on the ground, and it darted away. Louise walked away in the opposite direction to the one the cat had taken. There were other preparations to be made. As she walked, she whispered things to the doorknobs and the fireplaces, which stood up and saluted her. She was surprised to find that she thought of it as her tower. She wasn't surprised to find that the word school never occurred to her. Peanut oil being heavily used in the magical equivalent of dynamite, and in some delicious Thai dishes. Charlotte was angry, and confused, which made her even angrier. She had gotten Johnson's call and had immediately rushed out to help Devlin, only to find that the coordinates she had been given lead to a scorched crater in the ground, and nothing else. She had left the statue undefended to get out here in time. Didn't that old man understand how important that was? Well, of course he couldn't, but that was hardly the point. She had taken a room in an old village inn, staffed entirely by dirty old men, who kept leering at her unpleasantly. She almost wished that one of them would try something. She could use the exercise. She was sitting like this, feeling sorry for herself when her phone rang. She checked the number first this time. If it was Johnson again, then he could just sweat it out. But it wasn't Johnson, it wasn't even a number she recognized. Confused, she answered it. "Hello." "Yes, of course." "He's where?" "Why?" "Right, and what do you want me to do about it? Give me one good reason why I should go do that." He should have known what he was getting himself into, hanging around that place. Of course I still love him, what kind of question is that? Fine, I'll go. Who are you anyway? Hello? Hello? Whatever. Charlotte put her phone away. She realized, a little too late, that that conversation would have looked extremely odd to someone who only caught one side of it. She looked around, but all the old men were leering at her in the same way that they always did. Though she thought that the bar's only other costumer, a dwarf with his axe leaning against the bar, was less attentive on his drink than he had been a moment ago. She walked outside. It was a clear sunny day, which she felt was inappropriate. I'm going into battle, she thought, I'd better be remembered in songs for this. She ground the sole of her shoe into the ground, closed her eyes, and was gone. Back in the inn, the dwarf removed his earpiece and smiled. Greg had expected the old man to look uncomfortable when he woke up, but to his surprise, the man slept like an angel. Greg was a little put out by this. He had been beginning to think that his ability to sleep in car seats was the result of some inner tough man ability. He supposed that this could still be the case. After all, he still didn't know what kind of life the old man had led. He could see a faint glow on the horizon. His first thought was that they were getting close to Fox vision, but that couldn't possibly be right, the sun was up. Mages, the answer came to him, mages doing some kind of explosion test, as they tended to do. He grabbed Crazy Sven by the shoulder. We have to avoid that bright spot, he said. What and why would we? Being the Crazy Sven, run from little girly crotch light? It's mages, said Greg, it's got to be mages. He felt that this would be sufficient. So, said Crazy Sven, I am finding that the crotch robes are how you say? More fun than barrels through a monkey. It occurred to Greg that he had no idea what Crazy Sven had done while they had been in the EML. I think they're doing explosive testing up ahead, he said, realizing as he said it that it was probably the wrong card to play. To his surprise, Crazy Sven's reply went the unexpected route. What other kinds of testing do they do? He asked. Greg noticed that he had managed to get his grammar mostly right this time. He was wondering if this was a freak accident when Crazy Sven cut him off again. Anyway, he said, fun, and with that he wrenched the steering wheel and took the cab off-road. The lurching started again immediately. Greg had gotten too accustomed to driving on roads, so he jarred his hip against the door handle on the first bump. He heard someone voice behind him, oh dear me, it said, are we built to travel off-road? Greg wedged himself in the smallest cranny he could find. I don't think it matters, he said, it's what we're doing. Ah, said the man, who to Greg's mild annoyance was sitting in a perfectly regal manner in the back seat. Greg couldn't work out how he was remaining stationary. Do we know the origin of that strange light up ahead? I think it's mages, said Greg. He was making sure that he used the word think. He was beginning to think that given the kind of life he led it was a bad idea to say anything that might be quoted back to him. Oh indeed, said the man, who seemed quite at peace with the news. Greg stared. He was beginning to think that the man wasn't normal. Doesn't that worry you? He asked. I mean, mages do have a reputation of being dangerous people to be around. The man smiled and nodded. Indeed, he said, but if you are not doing anything to prevent it, then either you are managing the risk, or you don't have any control over where we are going. Either way, there's little need for me to worry about it. Greg tried to find a flaw in Thin's logic, but none was apparent. Incidentally, the man continued, are you aware that there is a canyon in between us and the light? Greg kept his face blank, but significant parts of his brain went wah to each other. He turned around just in time to feel the bumping stop and to see the cab starting to angle downwards. Claire was grateful to be out of her house, and she was very grateful that she had got out of her house without anyone outside it knowing. However, she was very put out that when the realtor had sold her house, he had failed to mention that there were secret passageways leading into it. The knowledge now didn't really make her feel safe, and she decided that she would be blocking off the tunnels as soon as she got home again, when this all blew over. She was in Sandra's apartment. She had slept there last night, something she only seemed to end up doing when she was in serious trouble. She could hear Sandra's voice from the kitchen. Do you want orange juice? She asked. Claire was on the verge of saying no. She didn't like imposing on hospitality, especially when the host is likely to remember at a later date, but some part of her was very aware that it hadn't eaten dinner last night. Yes, she said. Sandra walked in with 2 tall glasses of the fruity tasting stuff that people tended to buy at supermarkets. She gave one to Clare, who had wrapped herself in a blanket in the corner, and then sat in an old leather chair herself. Frankie should be here soon, she said, and he should be bringing Andrew with him. I don't think that Ants was very keen on helping us, but I threatened to mess with his internet connection, so he should be here in some form or another. When we're all here we can start. Clare nodded. She was still thinking about the tunnels leading out of her house. How did Frankie know how to get me? She asked Sandra. Sandra looked surprised and, Clare thought, a little annoyed that she was still thinking about that. They were just the old steam tunnels, she said. Frankie used to use them in his army days. Besides, Andrew guessed they were there as well. Apparently he used to explore them around his old college. Clare nodded. It all seemed really anticlimactic in a way. Her house was an old one, and its steam pipes had needed a specialized maintenance tunnel. They weren't really secret, they were just redundant and ignored by everyone who had known that they were there at all. Still, it was a tunnel leading directly into her house, and Clare didn't like that. It didn't make her feel safe. There was a knock at the door, and Sandra went to open it. Frankie filled the doorway like a huge British refrigerator. He walked in. Clare noticed that Sandra carefully slid around him, and took her seat again before he had a chance. Andrew bobbed along behind him like a little boat caught in the wake of a much larger, fast-moving continent. All the chairs in the small lounge were taken, so he just sort of squatted down on an available area of floor. Sandra didn't have a very large apartment, and particularly with Frankie here, there wasn't a lot of room for anyone else. She wondered where Ants was going to sit when he arrived. Knowing him, she thought, he'll probably hook his legs over the kitchen counter and hang down from there. Frankie put something small and expensive looking on the kitchen counter. He flicked it on, and what was clearly a screen flashed to life. There were the sounds of a small war from the other side. Someone was yelling orders and the sound of gunfire filled the room. Claire's eyes caught up with her brain. She saw Ants lying upside down on a couch somewhere. He had a controller in his hand and he was wearing a headset microphone, like the one that she was used to Sandra wearing. Ants flicked his eyes at them, and thumbed a button on his controller. The sound died down to a reasonable level, but kept going anyway. Let me know when you need something, he said, his eyes turning back to whatever he had been looking at. Sandra seemed to take this in her stride. Well, she said, now that we're all here, she glanced at the screen here, and gave it a significant look that Clare was sure that Ants couldn't see. We should go over our plan. All eyes turned to her, apart from Ants, whose ears picked up a little bit. You can't stay here, Sandra said. Another day and the press will start speculating on your untimely death. The key here is that we have to make you boring. Boring? Repeated Clare. Yes, you have to avoid doing anything interesting. If you do that for a week or two, then everyone will get bored and leave you alone. Clare thought about the moment when the sheer press of the diving press had threatened to swallow her alive. Being left alone sounded absolutely great right now. How do we do that? She asked. The important thing for you to do is to keep your normal routine going. You're going to go into work today and every day for the next few weeks at most. Clare thought of crowds of reporters outside the Daily Soapbox. Will Whirlwind like that? She asked. Sandra seemed to defer to Frankie on this one. Frankie looked at Sandra, and then back at Clare before answering. Whirlwind believes strongly in the rights of the reporter, he said, but he trained with our editor and he does appreciate that the newspaper is a business. He'll probably ask you to do a series of articles on what's happened since you've gotten back. Which you are going to do, said Sandra, but they are going to be written like a Puritan's guide to sex, dull and uninvolved. Clare felt that she could get behind this plan. Okay, she said, I'll play my part. For the first time since yesterday, she was starting to feel good about the future. Good, said Sandra, now for the rest of us. Ants. The figure on the screen made a small grunting noise. I need you to get sock puppets going on all the major forums. The key message is she's boring and I wish the news would show something else. Got that? Ants made another grunting noise, at a slightly higher pitch than the last one. Good, said Sandra. Frankie will be your partner for the series of articles, she continued. He is a good judge of people, and he's big enough to discourage any rough business. Frankie looked at Claire and smiled gently. I'll be coordinating the whole thing, Sandra went on, and smoothing everything over at the paper. She looked absolutely gleeful at the thought of the whole thing. She stopped there and didn't seem to have anything more to say. Claire noticed the missing player. What about Andrew? She prompted. What is he doing here? Sandra looked rather thoughtful, as though she had never really thought about the answer to that question. She looked at Andrew. Everyone else did as well. Andrew looked very uncomfortable under all the scrutiny. He drew little circles on the carpet with his fingertip. Wanted to help, he muttered with his eyes facing down. Claire knew she should feel some pity, but then she realized that it was one of the most coherent sentences she had ever heard Andrew form. Then the pity came, of course, but it had to wait until the shock died down. Do you remember how to get into that old steam tunnel? She asked. Andrew looked up and nodded, making something very close to eye contact. In my bedroom, she said. At the bottom of my wardrobe is a cardboard box with Mom's Christmas jumpers written on the side. Could you sneak in and get that for me? I think I'm going to be dressing down for a while. Apart from Ants, who was, from the sound of it, saving hostages at that point. The air was chill on the battlements, but Louise didn't mind it. It put her in mind of great stories from the past, epic dragon charges, and so forth, and that was the frame of mind she was in. She could see herself in line with the great leaders of the past. Queen Hectobirum stood on one side of her today, Nigel the Fork Twister on the other. It looked like almost all of the students in the school had answered her call. The windows and walls of the tower bristled with glowing people, who periodically exploded humorously. Everyone was waiting for the battle to begin. They were all very eager to throw the latest thing that they had made explosive in the direction of the squishy angel. Mages might make bad soldiers, Louise thought with a small smile, but they were damn terrifying opponents anyway. The EML tower was a very tall one, and Louise could see clear to the horizon. The sun was starting to rise. It was like an extremely enthusiastic fireworks display, or maybe a giant glowing egg, or possibly a nuclear furnace with enough power to melt the earth into a blob of impure iron. There was something about the sunrise which always made Louise feel poetic. The sunrise also helped Louise see more clearly. At this point she saw the black sparking thing advancing on the tower, with the attitude of something which has been traveling all night, and intends to reach its destination come hell or high water. Louise closed her eyes and let the calls of the birds around her enter her mind. She wanted to see what they thought about the intruder. The birdsong entered through her ears and filled her. She let the chirps and calls take on their true form. Yeah, bugger off, the birds called. Bugger off, you bugger. Louise opened her eyes. Good, she thought. We know exactly where it is, and that it isn't an illusion. She spread her feet a little further apart, and flexed her knees. The sparky thing was getting closer. It now looked like a jet, with its wings ripped off. She started to think about what kind of strategy would be effective. They need a live host, she remembered. Well, that's easy to work with. She thought about the forces that she had managed to assemble. We should mob it, she thought. We should let it get closer and then all jump on it at once. This will be an easy battle if we can stay coordinated. The jet was starting to get very close now. Another 10 seconds, she thought, and then we can cut loose. She spread her arms out as though she intended to catch the jet herself. A dragon soared past her and dived at the jet. Its rider was playing on a guitar which was flinging lightning bolts around in a semi-random manner. Oh, that's right, she remembered. I have absolutely no control over what's going on here. Apart from a small, bored group down near the base of the tower, they seemed to be seeing if they could make pigeons unstable enough to explode in a chain reaction. She left them to it, partially because she felt sure that they would find some way to use a chain of exploding pigeons in battle, but mostly because she felt absolutely sure that she would never be able to stop them. Tony's legs were starting to regain mobility, or maybe it was just him regaining his will to move. It was hard to really tell. All he knew was that he had spent yesterday propped in a corner of the jet, and now he could finally move again. The Sparky Man, who he thought was looking wilder than the last time he had seen him, was standing at the front of the jet and flicking his arms around like a man attacking a troublesome fly. When Tony looked out of the windows, he saw something very strange. He saw dragons in a variety of colors being swatted out of the sky in front of them. Sometimes they tried to breathe fire, but it always seemed to miss. Once he had digested this, he started to notice everything that his mind had been letting him build up to. There were flying toasters, someone was attacking them from the back of a giant creeper vine, there were flocks of tropical birds which kept dive-bombing them and exploding, and then there was the noise. Over the squawks and the roars and the many explosions, there was the sound of heroic background music. At least 20 different pieces of heroic background music, in fact, all playing against one another, and all getting louder as their players realized that they had a completion going. Tony tore his eyes away from the window, and then wished that he could do the same thing with his ears. The sound was getting louder than he had thought was possible. Soon it wouldn't matter if the dragons and house cats kept missing them. A man couldn't possibly keep a jet supported in mid-air after his head had imploded from sound pressure. The one lesson that Tony had taken from his high school English study was that there are two important skills in business and in life: knowing when to get in, and knowing when to get out. Tony definitely wanted out of this jet, preferably yesterday, before the attack started, but since that wasn't possible, he was very willing to just launch himself into the air and hope that he landed on something airborne, and not too far down. He walked as quietly as he could backwards, trying to keep his breathing as silent as possible. He almost ruined the whole thing when he tripped over something halfway to the giant hole in the side of the plane where the wings used to be. Biting down on his tongue, he looked back to see what he had tripped over. It was the other man, the one who had looked like he was watching a car crash. He looked worse than Tony had ever seen anyone look. He was curled up on the ground and shivering, and didn't even seem to notice that someone had tripped over him. There are certain aspects to a person's personality which are indelible. Tony went back to help. He grabbed the man under his shoulders and moved him like a giant sack of flour. He didn't think that the man would be in a position to help any time soon, and time was really critical here. He kept expecting to look up and see those crazy harsh eyes staring into his. The man was heavier than he looked, and Tony was as old as he looked. It was taking everything he had to move the man, and the plane wasn't getting any shorter. He felt something like an itch at the back of his brain, and then the plane suddenly got a lot shorter. Tony saw a flash of something that had too many mouths, before something like a bolt of concussive lightning slammed into the one part of the thing's face which seemed to contain an eye. Tony looked up, the itch in his brain getting stronger. An empty white pit stared back at him. Tony started to move backwards again, yanking as hard as he could on the man he was pulling. He was trying to fight it, but the terror was threatening to consume him. There was now a nice big hole really close, if only he could reach it in time. The man strode towards them, his hand raised. All manner of strange creatures were driven back past Tony. The sky was filled with things out of a chick tract, and they were all dead or dying. The man grabbed Tony by the front of the shirt, and lifted him as easily as if he was a rag doll. Tony couldn't see any mercy in those eyes, and he knew it was over. Asterisk. There is an old saying about how the prospect of being hanged in the morning focuses the mind beautifully. It really doesn't actually. What it does do is send the mind freewheeling, looking desperately for anything that might possibly hold a way out. This is why, when Tony finally faced a situation that he really couldn't think of a way out of, his mind started to focus on the strangest things. He remembered that he really liked the big lollipops that they used to give out at liquor stores. They were like a 3-course banquet to a young boy. He remembered that it was one of his daughter's birthdays exactly 3 weeks from now. He supposed that he wouldn't get to see her again. He finally paid attention to that weird itch at the back of his brain, and heard through the mental equivalent of heavy static, "Put the crystal on Devlin." Tony didn't know who Devlin was, but the crystal was something he hadn't considered before. Asterisk. The man raised his hand and put it on Tony's face. Tony slammed the crystal around the man's neck. The man's eyes flickered like a bad projector, and he started screaming. Then adrenaline flooded back into him, and he realized that the man's grip was slackening. By the time he realized this, he had already leapt into midair, and was descending rapidly. There were of course giant flying catapults launching house cats at the jet. Mages have a good sense for puns even if their taste in animal treatment is somewhat lacking. Professor Green's lab, with all the pretty blinking lights, disappeared, and suddenly Charlotte was in a much stranger place. It is very unpleasant to tour someone else's mind, you don't know your way around, and no one is motivated to give you any directions. It is also very difficult to tell what you are looking at inside of someone's head, except in the broadest of strokes. The fact that there are two minds in one head is a pretty broad stroke, for instance, and is quite hard to miss. Charlotte could see, or maybe feel, there didn't seem to be much difference in here, that the minds weren't really fighting, they were both focused on the same task, like two children sitting on the same couch and playing the same video game, and like two children they occasionally slapped each other out of annoyance or boredom. One of these minds had to be Devlin's. Charlotte made the mental equivalent of crossing herself and dived into the closest one. It was warm inside, and the pale gold light showed up thoughts, all neatly lined up like coffins. This was Devlin's, Charlotte was sure. She reached out with her mind and imagined stroking his hand again. The dust motes in the sunbeams started swirling like a little glowing tornadoes. They formed a giant face in the sky. The face broke apart and giant letters formed. They said, "Who?" "It's me," said Charlotte. The letters formed again. "Why?" They said. Charlotte swallowed. "Do you know what you're doing out there?" she asked. The letters reappeared, they were much solider this time. They said, "Sticking to the goal, completing the mission." "You're killing people out there, Devlin. You never killed people before, remember?" Charlotte hated herself for trying to manipulate him like this, but then she was already inside his head, so maybe it didn't really matter very much anymore. Apparently it didn't matter at all. The words formed again, solid and inarguable. "Stick to the goal, even if suffering comes." Charlotte sighed, she knew how this had to end. "What is the goal?" she asked. "You are." The letters appeared immediately this time, like a child at school who is pleased to know the answer to a question. Charlotte could feel a grabbing sensation in her upper chest. "I don't know if I want to marry someone who's killed people," she said. She probably should have phrased it stronger, but it would be enough. The letters took a long time to appear this time, and when they did they were weak and tentative, like hairline cracks in the light. "You don't know?" they asked. Charlotte decided that it was time she started being decisive. She steeled herself and stuck her chest out. "I don't want to marry someone who's killed someone," she said, the words even hurt her. There was a long pause, and Charlotte was worried that she had crossed the line. Then she felt the whole mind start moving around her, it was the feeling of a mind changing direction. Charlotte felt herself being carried along, like a woman caught in a massive swelling of the ocean. The letters formed in front of her. "I will find a way," they said, "a better way to achieve the goal." Charlotte couldn't remember feeling so happy before, she could feel tears starting to sparkle on her cheeks. Then the mind lurched, and Charlotte found herself outside again. The other mind was holding on, it wouldn't let go of Devlin's mind, no matter how he struggled. Charlotte felt the tension grow, it was like being outside just before a thunderstorm hits. Then the two minds fell on each other like wild dogs, there was a huge explosion and Charlotte was blown clear out of the mindscape. She felt her mind contract, as though it were being forced through a rubber hose. Then there was darkness. "That had to be the longest fireworks display that I have ever sat through," said Greg, still staring upwards. "Indeed? Then why didn't you leave?" "Was I complaining about the length?" "Did anyone hear me complaining about the length?" "I suppose I did not," said the man, smiling. Greg looked around, most of Fox Vision had come out to see the traveling mages fireworks show, but they were all heading back now, and that meant that he had to decide where they were going next. "I suppose we'll get an in tonight," he said, "and we can talk about our plans tomorrow." The man coughed. "I am sorry," he said, "but I'm afraid I really must decline. I've been invited to travel with some old friends for a small while, and I have accepted." "Oh," said Greg, a little put out, he had started to think of the man as part of his traveling group. "Does that mean that you're leaving tonight?" "Yes, I'm afraid it does." I really do have to start walking soon if I'm going to make it to the pickup point in time. Then this is goodbye? For now, I'm afraid so. Greg walked silently for a moment. He wasn't good at goodbyes. He turned to the man and extended his hand, which the man took. Goodbye, he began, and then stumbled as he realized that he had yet to ask the man's name. He felt extremely awkward, but luckily the man seemed to understand, and came to his rescue. Gillespie, he said. Something clicked together in Greg's memory. Oh, he said, are you Gillespie the Dash? Bridge builder, the man cut in, the one from the sign. Yes indeed I am. Right, but I was going to ask if you were Gillespie Dash. The bridge builder. Greg's head finally caught up with his mouth. Right, he said, sheepishly shaking the man's hand. Gillespie the bridge builder. Traveling mages tended to have much greater control over their ability than the normal ones, that or they could just be really good at outrunning pitchfork-waving mobs. Either way it's fun for the whole family. In the middle of a forest so black that the trees have personalities and deserts named after them, there is a smoking crater. Even though it smokes, the crater isn't hot. There is a cold wind cutting through this place, which chills so deeply that the people walking in it wonder if they'll ever be warm again. There is a man in the center of the crater. His clothes are torn, his hair is a mess, and he has the kind of beard that people get when they normally shave but haven't been able to for slightly too long. This man lies with face down in the dirt. He rocks back and forth a little, and he alternates light sobbing and muttering to himself. If you listen really closely, you can even make out the things he is saying. Some other way. No other way. Some different lead. Only one lead. I have another lead, said a voice. The man in the crater looked up. There was a dwarf watching him, leaning casually on his axe. My name is Katakamatatama, said the dwarf, and I think we can help each other. Greg watched the sunrise from a park bench, simply for the sheer novelty of being able to watch the sunrise without someone attacking him. The light spread beautifully over the town, showing all the buildings to the fresh morning. Foxvision had changed a lot since his youth. He could remember standing next to his uncle after they had started leveling the ground, and telling him that an interspeciated town could never work. Greg looked around and had to admit that he had been wrong on that count. It was a real shame that he would never get to tell his uncle that, and an even greater shame that he hadn't realized it himself years ago. He was sure that there was some way to exploit the concept of interspeciated towns for profit. He walked down a convenient alleyway to take a more direct route back to the inn. There was a plump cat cleaning itself on top of the wall. It looked up as he passed, but otherwise ignored him. Greg knew that he couldn't stay here. It was far too obvious a place for him to go, the town founded by his uncle. Hell, he thought, we were never meant to come here in the first place. He had meant to lay a trail towards the town and then veer off into the wilderness, but then they had picked Gillespie and he hadn't been able to talk with Crazy Sven, and then there had been the cliff. Greg shook his head, rubbing his temples with his fingertips. Crazy Sven, now there was another issue altogether. The taxi simply wasn't going to run again. Greg wasn't a mechanic, but that much was obvious. He wasn't much of a people person either, but even he could see that Crazy Sven had adopted a bedside manner towards his car, which would be appropriate for a sick child. Crazy Sven wouldn't leave, no matter how much he wanted to stay with Greg. Greg found himself hoping that something would attack them, purely so he would be able to leave without having to say goodbye. He wondered just when he had become so emotional, and why. It really hurt. There was something else too. Greg's reasonable mind wasn't entirely dulled. Crazy Sven couldn't do stealth. Greg didn't think he would even have to ask. The man was the polar opposite of lying low. Laying low with him would be like walking around with a 4-kilometer-wide target pinned to the top of his head. For the first time since the man had splinted his broken leg at the bottom of a mountain, he had stopped being an asset and had turned into a huge liability, and for the first time in his life, Greg hated himself for thinking in those terms. When this is over, thought Greg, and I am rich beyond the majority of my dreams, I'll pay Crazy Sven back somehow. I mean, it's not like the taxi is entirely unfixable. We just need to replace the suspension, and the wheels, and the gearbox, and the chassis. Greg shook his head again. I'm doing that a lot, he realized. I hope I don't end up wrinkled from all this worrying. Then he smiled. Wrinkles were a really stupid thing to be worrying about. I'll have to tell him, Greg decided. I'll have to say goodbye properly. But maybe not today. This village is comfortable, and there will be time tomorrow. Tony woke up like a man who really wishes that he was still asleep, exactly like that actually. He had slept in his clothes, and the dressing on his shoulder had been drenched in sweat overnight. It was starting to smell. Tony pushed his hands against the bed under him, and forced himself into a kind of sitting position. The duvet was heavy over his legs, like it was trying to push him back down. He wished he could go back to sleep, but he knew that it was too late in the day. He pushed himself out of the bed. Even through his socks, the cobblestone floor was cold. Tony smiled. It was a genuine cobblestone floor, inside and God knows how many stories up. Yesterday he had been kidnapped by an angel, and the day before that he had been working to rebuild a burned town. Life was a weird thing, Tony thought. He turned his mind back to the issue at hand. Food, he thought, breakfast, maybe 2 breakfasts, followed by a tasteful 10-course banquet. Shower too, maybe shower first actually. He reached the door and put his hand on the doorknob, but then something stopped him. The dead dorm, the helpful lady had called it, where magic couldn't touch you. Tony took his hand off the knob. She hadn't told him how to get food though. Maybe that was something that he was meant to figure out on his own. He would have to face the magic eventually. Tony looked back into the dorm. The only other inhabitant was the man who Tony had rescued from the sparkly jet. Tony didn't think he would make good company. He had fallen asleep as soon as he had stopped shivering and was now lying in the bed, stiff as a corpse. Tony decided not to wake him. He looked like he could use all the sleep he could get. He turned back to the door and rested his hand on the doorknob again. It was a perfectly normal doorknob. It wasn't even shaped like some sort of magical creature. It was just a simple metal door handle. Tony took a deep breath, reached inside himself, squared his shoulders, breathed out because he had been holding his breath for a while, took another deep breath, and opened the door. Claire opened the office doors with a smile. She had spent hours in front of the mirror practicing that smile. It was pleasant but not newsworthy, just another office drone going home after a long day. The sun was getting low in the sky, so it was kind of hard to tell, but she thought that there might be fewer reporters on the front steps than there were normally. The idea cheered her up and added another edge to her smile. Got to get that under control, she thought. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw Frankie leaving a discreet distance behind her. She didn't see how he was meant to intimidate the reporters from such a long way back, but it felt good to know that he was there. There were other people around her, of course. Sandra had been clear on the fact that she should try to leave every day in a loose group, so she had waited in the entrance hall until a suitably large group had appeared, and then she had just mingled with them. She found that mingling wasn't as fun as it used to be. It seemed like everyone in the building seemed to have an opinion on her new fame, which ranged from hearty congratulations to muttering and mutinous looks. So far though everyone had kept their feelings on the slow burn, she just hoped that they stayed that way until all the reporters left. All the reporters fell into step with her, and started asking questions, but they were the same questions that they had asked yesterday. They really didn't have anything else to go on. She had given them nothing to work with, and she could see on their faces that the great pluralities of reporters were getting bored with her. It was like her first boyfriends all over again, except now she was doing it on purpose. Claire was still staying in her house, although she now kept a panic switch on her bedside cabinet. She had even used the tunnel to sneak back into her house again after reporters had bombarded her that first morning. As far as they knew, she had just stayed inside all day and they'd gone to work late the day after. Opening the door again and facing the reporters properly for the first time was one of the most difficult things that Claire had ever had to do. It had taken 3 hours and several calls to Sandra to work up the courage, but she had done it. Looking back now, she wished the plan had involved using the press somehow. She knew it was playing with fire, but she was almost certain she wouldn't get burnt. Maybe next time, she thought. I bet there is a huge adventure here, just waiting for someone to get on board. Then she had the image of the press pouncing on her again. Too much, she thought, next time we'll have lower stakes. When she rounded the corner, she had a pleasant jolt of surprise. There had been people literally camping on her lawn before, there had been reporters in issue tents, news crews in their vans, bystanders in multicolored monstrosities, but now it was all gone, even the bystanders. The only thing that marked her house out as being different was that she recognized it. For the first time in a few days, it really felt like it was her house, rather than some sort of communal property. She opened her front door and walked in, making sure that she locked the door behind her. Then she walked through all the rooms at a quick pace, letting her eyes and ears explore. She didn't hear or see anything odd. Once she was sure that her house was empty, Clare smiled. Dinner now, she thought, then bed, I'm very tired.